Um, so let's make a slow start so that we can begin with the presentations at 10 sharp. Welcome to everyone who is joining us again this morning. We continue with the workshop on dimensions of well-being, organized as part of the Froggy Project Forum for Research on Gender Economics. This project is part of a bigger program of the Free Network, an initiative of the Free Network and network of institutes in Central and Eastern Europe, focused on various dimensions of development in the region. And the program and the Froggy project are generously supported by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. So we're grateful for this support. The plan for today is a little bit different than yesterday. We will continue with the standard format of presentations, and we will have three sessions of 2 papers, each with about 30 minutes for the presentation, a discussion, and then time for questions. And we will finish with a session of questions and answers where we will gather all participants, all presenters, for a sort of open discussion and further questions perhaps from the participants and also from the presenters to each other. We will begin today with a presentation by Claudius Garten on home ownership and material security in old age, which will be followed by a presentation by Barbara Pertold-Gebicka, Family Size and Subjective Well-being in Europe. And the 2 presenters will discuss each other's papers later on. It's 10 o'clock, so I hope everyone who planned to join is already with us. Welcome to everyone once again. Just a reminder on the technical side, this seminar, this workshop is being recorded, and I hope no one has any reservations about that. But if you do, it's the time to voice it now. Okay, without further ado, 1 minute past 10, Claudius, the screen is yours, you can start.
Thank you for the invitation and thanks for the introduction. Can you see my screen right now?
You can see it, but it's not in full screen mode.
And now
it is. Now it is. Great, thank you.
Okay. Good. So today I want to give you an insight of our analysis of the relationship between home ownership and assets in home value, place of residence, and the subjective measures of material security reflected by subjective expectations of standard of living. So this analysis is part of a project AgeWell that focuses on material conditions and well-being in old age in Germany and Poland. The presentation here has an extended perspective on the European context, though. The whole project is funded by the German Research Foundation and the National Science Center in Poland. It's a cooperation between the Chair for Social Structure and Aging Societies at the Technical University in Dortmund and the Center of Economic Analysis in Szczecin. The initial idea was to have a detailed look at the role of material security in the context of extensive findings of higher well-being and health for homeowners. So home ownership serves as a financial backup and flow of irregular consumption that affects well-being. We concentrated on 2 causal links between material security and home ownership. These were first that homeowners are more independent from the rental market and from owners' decisions, and secondly, homeowners might also see their home as an asset to secure against financial risks. On the other hand, they are also more prone to the risk of price volatility because the largest amount of assets are stuck in the home value. So selling, when they sell their home, they might profit from rising property prices, but they also might face risks of value loss in regions with stagnating or even decreasing property prices. So the effect of regional housing market differences is crucial, and it has been studied for well-being of homeowners in the US, but the information on regional differences in Europe are scarce. We used the second wave of the survey of health, aging, and retirement in Europe to do our analysis, and our analysis includes almost 30,000 respondents from 14 European countries and Israel. In this second wave from SHARE, the respondents were asked 2 questions on their expectations for their standard of living in the future, and from this we constructed an ordinal measure of material security, and therefore we used ordinal probit regression models with country-level fixed effects, and we also included cluster robust standard errors because of the clustering of respondents on the household level. So the main question that we used as for our dependent variables were, what are the chances that 5 years from now your standard of living will be better than today or worse than today? And respondents had to give a numerical response between 0 and 100 to these 2 subsequent questions. And as you can see in this figure, there exist hums at 0 and 50, and there's also a tendency to use rounded numbers. So these 0s and 50s might reflect something as don't know and equally likely, thoughts of equally likely. But as we used these 2 questions together, I will show you how we handled this. So these 2 questions can be interpreted as subjective probabilities for the single events, but the questions were asked subsequently for the 2 related events. So what we think is that there was no joint probability distribution for both events in mind of the respondents when responding to this first question. So they might have used the second question to adjust for the first one to express a probability in relation to their first response. For example, if someone answered 50 to the question 1 to be better off, and then the question answered 60 to the question 2 to be worse off, they might wanted to express that they think it's more likely that they will be worse off than better off. So for this reason, we had a substantial amount of responses whose sum exceeded 100, and to deal with this, we used the differences between both responses as a measure of material security. We then coded these differences into 5 different categories because of the hums and the rounded responses. And this results in these categories A to E that you can see on the right side, which represent very likely worse off, rather likely worse off, equally likely, rather likely better off, and very likely better off. The relation between these responses to the original questions and categories and the figure are shown on the right, and as you could already see, and and how these categories are defined is shown on the left side now. So differences smaller than -50 were coded as very likely worse off. Differences greater than or equal to -50 but smaller than 0 were coded as rather likely worse off. A difference of exactly 0 was coded equally likely, and the same procedure was done for the positive values. So central to our analysis was the ownership status and the place of residence. For this, we used the category for renters, and then we divided the homeowners by their country-specific quartiles of home value for the homeowners, which resulted in 5 categories in total. For the residents of the respondents, we used the question of whether someone lived in a big city or not. That was discussed in that was taken from the interview. Also, we included an interaction between both ownership status and the urban living to test differences for ownership status by residents. We also included controls that were likely to affect expectations on standard of living. These were the socio-demographic characters such as gender, age, family, and job status, as well as household income and financial assets. For income and assets, we again used country-specific quartiles as a variable. We also included measures of physical and mental health and overall well-being. These were the dummies for the instrumental activities of daily living and the Euro-D scale, and life satisfaction on an 11-point scale. To have a start, I show you now the distributions for the countries on the dependent variable in relation to the home ownership rate. And the countries are ordered from low to high ownership rates from left to right. And as you can see, to the right, Ireland, and also in the middle, Denmark, and rather to the right, Israel tend to have a more optimistic respondents, whereas France, Germany, and the Czech Republic, which are in the middle and to the left, seem to be more one of the most pessimistic respondents. So in this graph, we can see there's some between country variation, which might be weakly related on this macro level to home ownership rates, suggesting that people in countries with higher home ownership rates are slightly more likely to be more optimistic about this standard of living. But coming to the individual micro perspective, I want to show you the differences in the optimism and pessimism measure of the ownership, and also the differences in the area. So as you can see here, the blue hollow bars represent the urban residents, while the red bars are the percentages of rural residents. And from left to right are the categories of material security. So there's very likely worse off on the left side and very likely better off on the right side. And within these categories, respondents are grouped by ownership status. So renters are on the left and homeowners of the highest quartile on the right side. And there's also a bar for the totals on the right. If we look at the totals, we can see that it's more likely for urban residents than for rural residents to be better off, or rather better off. And it's the other way around for being worse off. Also, in line with this, we can see on the right side that for categories D and E, for being rather or likely better off, urban homeowners with high valued homes are more likely to report higher levels of material security than their rural counterpart, on which you can see in the difference between the bars. Also, rural homeowners of higher quartiles are more likely to report to be worse off than their urban counterpart. And on the far left side, you can see that renters and homeowners of homes with low value in urban areas are more likely to report to be worse off than their rural counterpart. To further investigate these differences, we used ordinal probit regression models with country dummies for fixed effects. And here are shown the coefficients for ownership status, residence, and the interaction effect between both. While below you can see which specifications include which control variables. So while there is an effect for home ownership status in the first specification, this effect gets smaller and vanishes when socio-demographic factors are included. So on the final specification, only homeowners in the highest quartile have significantly higher values of material security. And also residents in urban areas report slightly lower levels, although these are not significant. However, the not significance is not true for the interaction of the urban residents and ownership status. So that means that urban homeowners of higher quartiles have higher levels of material security than urban renters or homeowners of lower quartiles, and also than rural residents. But what do these results mean substantially? So are the differences suggested by the regression coefficients large or small? To answer this question, we computed predictive margins for the different status of home ownership. And to compare the effects, we also did this for income and financial assets. So in this table, you can see the probabilities for the outcome A being worse off and outcome E being better off. And in the columns that are named expected probability, you can see these absolute probabilities. For example, a wealthy homeowner of the highest quartile has a probability of expecting to be better off of 9%, as you can see in the fourth column. And also we included the absolute and the relative differences between groups in the columns that are named difference. So the absolute differences are between homeowners and of the highest quartile and renters are about only 1 to 2%, as you can see, which means that they are that homeowners of the highest quartile are 12% less likely to be worse off and 16% more likely to be better off, speaking in relative terms. And as you can see, these differences are larger than the differences between other categories such as income or financial assets. If you look at the differences in the financial assets, these differences are only 6% or 8% respectively, and the absolute differences are also smaller. So to have a look at this interaction effect that we were interested in, I want to show you this figure, which shows the relative differences in probabilities between owners from different quartiles and with renters as the reference. Rural residents are in the graph on the left side, and urban homeowners and renters are on the right side. So the differences between respondents of different ownership statuses stay small for the rural residents, and the relationship is non-monotonic. Whereas on the right side, there is a clear pattern for these urban residents. The differences are large, and the relationship with ownership status is monotonic for these urban residents. In that way, urban homeowners of the highest quartile are 40% more likely to be in the very likely better off category than urban renters. Conversely, they are 20% less likely to be in the very likely worse off category than urban renters again. Coming to the conclusions, these results complement the extensive evidence on the relationship between well-being and home ownership, and they can broaden the discussion on the causal nature of the relationship. So we concentrated on the role of home ownership for well-being in terms of material security, using the expectations of respondents on their standard of living in the future. We showed that homeowners feel more optimistic about future material conditions than renters, and this is strongly related to the possession of more expensive homes and place of residence. So that way, owners of expensive homes in urban areas are the most optimistic group, and urban renters are the most pessimistic. This suggests that respondents anticipate the rising rents and property prices in urban areas. The effect overall may seem small in absolute terms, but it's rather large when compared to other effects of material resources, such as household income or financial assets. And it shows material security is an important dimension of well-being, and it affects the present consumption and saving decisions and can thus have an impact on other dimensions of well-being. For example, if investments in current health are limited, this means that this also affects might also have a negative impact on health and thus on the well-being. So findings of higher variance among those with less material resources might also reflect the larger uncertainty in that case. There's a lower level of material security for renters and homeowners with low-valued homes, and this can be channeled to low levels of well-being both in the present and in the future. There are some pending questions, and this reflects how is the situation after the second wave of shares, because since 2007 the property prices increased in Europe, especially in urban areas. And this might have further improved the material security for homeowners. For renters, on the other hand, this bears the risk of increasing rents and lower affordability of good quality housing. So policymakers could intervene with protection programs for renters, and especially if their income stays stable and if they live in urban areas, or they could support the access to credit and affordable housing. Thank you for your attention. Now I'm happy for your comments and questions.
Thanks, Claudius. Thanks a lot for the presentation. The discussant for this paper is Barbara Pertold-Gebicka. Barbara, you have slides, share them, or just
yeah. Okay. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Let me share my few slides that will help me with my comments. So it's here. I hope I got it right.
Yes, we can see it all. Thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, I can see that there was some more in the presentation. That was great. So, some of my questions were already answered. So I will start with the second slide. So I would say that this is a very relevant question, and I really liked reading about it. My first issues when I started reading the paper is like, okay, but how you measure the financial security, and here I really liked the construction of the financial security variable, which convinced me that that despite all the problems with reporting, you managed to get something that is supposed to capture how people view their financial future, so to say. So this is one of the big strengths of that paper, in my opinion. What is a little bit missing, in my view, is the theoretical framework, where I did not fully understand the channels that might be behind the relationship. So let me switch back here when I was trying to follow the logic presented in the paper. So now, correct me if I got it well or wrong. So you were saying that in the literature there is a link. Okay, so previous literature has identified the link between home ownership, right, and well-being. So this link has been established in the literature, and the question is, why would home ownership lead to increased well-being? And what you propose, I think, is that the financial security provided by home ownership might be the channel, right? So if I understood it correctly, then I think that the proposal is that the financial security steps in the middle of this relationship, and to prove it, or to provide some evidence that this might be the channel, you concentrate on this intermediate channel, right? So your goal is to figure out what is the relationship between home ownership and financial security. So you concentrate on this link in the paper. And then the empirical part of the paper is concentrated around estimating this relationship. So I tried writing down a very simple relationship, which is simpler than the one that you estimate. But at least for me, it's always easy to think about stuff when I see the equation. So I wrote it down here, where you have the measure of financial security, the one that I like so much. And basically you regress it on the ownership status, which here I marked as just the one variable, but you have it as a categorical variable with five possible categories, right? Either there is a renter, or there are four, or you are an owner, but the ownership is divided according to the value of the property into four quartiles. So to understand this relationship, one has to think about the channels that are behind it, and yeah, there are many of those. So some were mentioned in the presentation. This is what I appreciated. So I think there is still a place to discuss more of that. And as you acknowledge at the end, it's really difficult to figure out whether there is any causal relationship between house ownership and the feeling of perception of financial security. But then you add many control variables that are supposed to bring you closer, I guess, to the causal relationship. So we can think that, well, people, like more educated people, predict future or try to secure their future better. So they would probably act in order to secure some housing for themselves, which would make them feel secure for the future. But it's probably not that the housing makes, or part of this relationship that we observe might be not because having a house increases financial security, but generally because highly educated people secure financial security or secure financial stability. But then you control for education, so that channel is dealt with. But it would be nice to have actually written down in the paper, so that the reader, understands or gets into the flow of thoughts. Because then some of the control variables, I could find this reasoning, like with the education, while for some other control variables I was actually a bit lost. So maybe you could guide us here. So for example, life satisfaction that is added to the last specification confused me a little bit, because I went back to this scheme that is outlined in the introduction, where well-being, which is often approximated by life satisfaction, right, is actually supposed to be the outcome. And then when it's put here among the explanatory variables, then I'm actually not sure what it is supposed to do with this relationship, whether it's supposed to deal with some sort of endogeneity, or whether it is supposed to identify the relationship between house ownership and financial security that is outside of this well-being effects, or what's the point of that? So this reasoning is a bit missing from the paper. And the last point, there's this heterogeneity analysis that you're doing, which is great. Here you compare urban and rural citizens. And again, I was thinking, like, why would that be? So I'm not saying that I know why it is. It's just that it would be great to have some hypothesis here. So I think I have it on the next slide. Yeah. So, for example, it could be that in cities, there is much higher variation in home ownership. while in rural areas, almost everyone lives in their own house. So there would be less variation, at least in comparison to the excluded category. So that could lead to the results that we observed, although it is not necessarily the case. So it would be nice really to investigate more into that relationship. So as you can see here, I had like several ideas that might be driving some of the relationships that we observe. Could be inspiring, or could be looked at. While you were presenting, I was also thinking that I don't know if the data allows, but maybe you could break at least some of the endogeneity by seeing whether the house they live in is something they acquired or maybe they inherited that. Or, you know, because it's generally like the example of education I brought earlier, we can generally think like in the middle bullet point that the risk-averse individuals would be ones that really prepare for the future. They would secure housing, but they would also make investments and have savings on their accounts and so on. So if the research question is whether house ownership per se has effect on the feeling of financial security or on well-being, maybe one could take individuals who have approximately the same assets, no matter whether they are liquid assets or assets like home. And within, you know, asset holders, see whether it matters how these assets are divided into, let's say, financial assets and homes, like, because these are the variables that you do have. I don't know, these are my thoughts just that appeared just during the presentation. So I treat it very relaxedly, but yeah, just thinking how to take more out of this, because it sounds really interesting to investigate.
Thanks a lot, Barbara. Claudius, there's still a few more minutes, so you can, if you have some initial thoughts how to respond to that, go ahead, and we could also take questions from either the floor or the presenters.
Okay, so I start with responding. So thank you for this good questions and nice remarks that you made, and sure, the links for the causal links we used for the controls, we can pronounce them a bit more in the text right now. But what I think about the life satisfaction and why it's included is mainly because we wanted to have a look at whether it is a different concept than financial security, and it's only driven by these subjective measures of health and well-being and life satisfaction. So in this sense, looking at your path model, it's not reasonable to do it, but looking at this point of the measurement, it made sense to us. So. But it's clearly a good idea to have a second thought of how to establish this connection from the material security, from home ownership to well-being via the financial security. So this is really helpful. And to coming to these hypotheses for rural-urban differences, we were really concentrated on the differences because of housing prices relationships for urban and rural regions. So the alternative explanations that you brought in, they are truly meaningful, and I think it makes sense to, for example, as you said, look at how someone acquired his home, or if, for example, say how long they stayed in this home. But yeah, maybe we need to stress a little more that we are really about these rural-urban differences in terms of housing prices, which unfortunately are not that easy to directly merge to this kind of data set. So this is one of the drawbacks in that case. But I really like the idea about the assets, to look at the distribution of assets to home value and financial assets and see if there were a difference about, across individuals with similar asset values. That's a great idea. Thank you.
You're welcome. And treat my comments really as a through thoughts, because I'm aware that it's difficult to estimate causal things, and just everything that came to my mind I said loudly. Maybe some of this will be helpful.
It sure will.
Thanks a lot, Barbara, for your comments. There's, I can see something in the chat, but it's just an announcement. Okay. Anthony, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I do actually. Just out of curiosity, I just wanted to know how sensitive the results are to the initial transformation you do of the expectations. You use the threshold of 50 minus 50. Did you play around with these numbers and try to see if the results are sensitive?
Yes, we also did that. For example, for the equal likely, we broadened the boundaries so that there's plus between -5 and +5 and things like that. And also did this for the other boundaries, and the results mainly stayed the same. It's also we had to exclude some of the people who responded with "don't know" or refused their answers, and we also included them once in the multi-nominal logic regression then in that case, and the results stayed mainly robust in this in the direction of the relationship. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Maybe if I may, I have another, just out of curiosity, because I worked a little bit with share. So share is longitudinal, but the expectations, we only have them in wave 2, not in wave 4, 5.
Are they in wave 1? I'm not sure. Right now.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking like one way to address, the causality wouldn't be perfect if you had individual fixed effect, you would get rid of a lot of problems. But if it's observed only once.
Yeah. So yeah, this longitudinal question, I'm at a different point, coming to a different point now, because of course it's related to the future, this question, and so maybe from a methodological point, truly fixed effects are useful, but I was also thinking about the that it's the actual state in the future, what is it reflecting on that, but it's a totally different chapter, I guess. Yeah. So.
If I may, so
go ahead, yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a similar question as Anthony. Why do you choose like wave 2? Probably I missed it, and you said if there is any reason why exactly wave 2 is the one that you pick up from share. That's the first question. And the second one, what I was thinking about is, maybe you can try matching of like trying to find similar individuals with all characteristics, including education, employment, I don't know, liquidity asset, as Barbara was saying. But then the only thing is different is home ownership. I don't know if it's plausible. So given that like a number of individuals always scarce, so but still, did you try it, or if you didn't, or if you did, what the results? Thanks.
Thank you. This is a nice idea. We haven't done this matching of similar cases, and we chose wave 2 mainly because it's about the question on the being better, worse off. It wasn't. It was not in one of the other ways, and I'm not 100% sure if it was in wave 1 or not, but I don't think it was there. But if it was, the problem would be that there were some more included in where you have a problem with the cases. Then again, because of wave 2, this changed. I think it was better. Yeah, but yeah, the matching process is truly something to think of if it is were to look at this from the number of cases perspective. Yeah.
Thanks. We have a question here in the chat, and there's still a minute to go. So let me read it out. If I understand correctly, home ownership is classified by value of home. Is this the best way to classify home ownership? I'm thinking about a low-income individual owning a 300,000 house versus a high-income individual owning a 300,000 house. It seems like the financial security of these two would be quite different.
Okay. This is a nice question, and this is also was in the previous questions, that to think of how to compare different individuals and according to their home value. So I think this could be either can be done with different methodologic methods adjustments. For example, it could be also a possibility to think of interaction in terms of income and home value, or the method just proposed by Lisa could be a solution to deal with this. But it's right, at some point it doesn't really matter anymore. That's true, and might be also especially true if you come to these high values of home ownership. Having a high valued home in an urban area truly is something a very special situation, and there's this question if it's still comparable across the sample. That's right, yes.
And Anne Lafarrea is asking, I was wondering if in general rural people felt less financially secure, and if you have an explanation for that. Are they not the majority of the population, the rural sample?
So at least from our ordinal see that there was such a relationship between urban and rural differences in being better off or worse off. So I don't know if they really feel less financially secure, to say at all. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Let's move on. There's still some more questions in the chat, but I think we will move on for the second presentation, and there will be a general question and answer session at the end of the workshop. So we will be able to come back to those. So let me now pass on to Barbara, who will discuss the paper entitled Family Size and Subjective Wellbeing in Europe. Do more children make us unhappy? Go ahead.
Thank you for the introduction. Okay, let me share the slides again. I hope you can all see the slides well.
Yes, we can see it. Go ahead.
So thanks for the possibility to present our paper on this nice workshop. This is a joint work with Dominika Szpolcowa. We both work at Charles University in Prague. We concentrate on the relationship between the family size, or the number of children, and subjective well-being. And why we do that? Well, fertility is one of the challenges that we are facing, and I think I don't have to repeat it again, that it has a lot of consequences. And if we talk about the developed world, then the consequences are rather negative in terms of population shrinking and unstable pension or healthcare systems. So there has been a lot of research devoted into the causes of decreased fertility. And usually, the answers such as that children are costly, directly and indirectly, and also that the benefits of having many children became lower, right? in the old times, people decided to have children, for example, to secure them in the old age. Now, because we have the universal pension system, people don't have to rely on their own children. They rely on the general system. And now, they do not internalize the fact that their own children, together with the children of others, will have to pay for those pensions. So this is why I think it's still relevant to look on the reasons why people decide to have few children. And I think that the well-being derived from children is one of the ways we can look on it, because the subjective, the perceived well-being would summarize, the costs and benefits in the way how parents view them. So we are basically asking in this paper whether the observed fertility is a result of well-being maximizing decisions. If it was, then whenever people plan children, so each planned child should increase the well-being. But on the other hand, the unplanned child should result in decreased well-being. And this is generally the setup that we are investigating. We are obviously not the first ones to look at the link between having children and subjective well-being. So there's a very rich literature that is analyzing the relationship between being a parent and subjective well-being. So here we talk about the extensive margin. I'm not citing all the papers because this literature is really large. It's not only in economics, but also sociology, psychology. But I would refer you to the very recent work by Blanchfelder and Clark, where they summarize a lot of that literature. The question, the relationship between the number of children and parental well-being, that is the intensive margin. This relationship is much less investigated. There are actually very few studies that do it. And here I would refer you to the most recent study by Priba. And the point is that it's a bit more difficult to identify this relationship. And you will see in my presentation that I devote a lot of time to discuss it. And I will welcome all the comments to our identification. Because of that, the literature up to date is unlimited to the developing countries. So what we do in our paper, we ask whether there is any effect of the causal relationship between the number of children that people have and their well-being. And we concentrate on developed countries, precisely speaking on Europe. And what we also do, we do not look at children, at all children, generally on the number of children, but we look at it by children age, that is to see whether parents with young children are better or worse off when they have many children. And then we also zoom on parents with older children to see whether there are any heterogeneous effects here or whether there is any dynamics there. It's always difficult to estimate this sort of relationship because there is strong selection into the number of children. All these papers saying that happy people have children. I would also say that happy people have more children. So there's a need to break the endogeneity. And here we turn to the twin birth instrument, which is nice when we think about the interpretation of the results, because then when the number of children is instrumented by twin birth, then the identifying variation comes from additional unplanned child, where people plan to have, they have one child, let's say, they plan on having another, and then instead of having one new child, they'll have two. So the third child in that case is the unplanned one, and we can nicely interpret our results as the effect of additional unplanned child, which would then help us answer the question whether the current let's say fertility levels are well-being maximizing, or whether we could increase the well-being by having more children. So just a quick preview of findings in case we spent a lot of time on identification strategy. So while we look at different groups of parents, the most reliable results are the results of the third child on parental well-being, which are identified when looking at parents who decide to have a second child, and by chance this second pregnancy is a twin pregnancy. And we see that when all parents, independent on children age, but all parents with 2 or 3 children are pulled together, then we observe a very weak or actually a 0 effect. But things look different when we zoom on parents with children in specific age groups, where we see a strong negative effect among the parents of the youngest children. So the third child effect is negative in this group of parents, but among the parents, especially among the fathers of teenage children, we actually see a positive effect of a third child. And this effects seem to be driven or are related to dissatisfaction with time allocation when children are young, or the increased frequency of feeling nervous when having the very young Ingrid children. And at higher child ages, we observe just the opposite. So we observe the decreased frequency of experiencing negative feelings. Okay, so data. Sorry, the data for some reason got lost. So for the data, we use the SILC, this Survey of Income and Living Condition, the European data. We use every 5 years. Recently, there is an additional questionnaire, an ad hoc questionnaire with the well-being module, and we rely on that well-being module here. And this allows us to use actually 2 well-being measures. The first well-being measure is life satisfaction. It is the measure that is the most commonly used, and based on the question asking the respondents to evaluate their life. It is measured on a 0 to 10 scale, so 11 distinct categories. And it's often interpreted as an instantaneous utility. Like, even though people actually value their, yes, because they value their life nowadays. So that's how we can broadly interpret it. While this measure has been widely analyzed, and you can see it in almost every paper related to subjective well-being, then it also is criticized a lot because of difficulty to compare it between people, but especially across countries or social groups. And this is because life satisfaction is, when people assess their life, they usually anchor it to something, to their expectations, to their social group, to some norms, and so on. And another problem or critique that this measure has received is that because it's measured on the ordered scale, it might be misleading when we use mean-based regressions. So not only OLS, but also the ordered regressions actually might bring misleading results, as the Bond-Lang critique says. However, there are some more recent papers actually showing that when the measure is as detailed as we use, like an 11-point scale, then this critique is less applying to those. But still, to offer another view on subjective well-being, we propose an alternative measure, which we construct ourselves, and we call it a happiness index. It's an index because it summarizes 5 different aspects of well-being, or 5 different feelings. So in this well-being addition to the SIL data, sorry, there are 5 questions where respondents are asked to say how often during the last month they experienced specific feelings. And these feelings ran from happy to nervous. And they are measured on a 5-point scale, where from never or rarely to negative, or to to neutral, being the 3, and then 5 being like always. So what we do, we take all 5 questions that measure the frequency of feelings, and we create an index by summing the positive feelings and subtracting or adding with a minus the negative feelings, which then the resulting measure could be interpreted as a relative frequency of experiencing the positive feelings over the last month. To make it comparable to the life satisfaction measure, we normalize it and fit it to the 0-10 scale, which but we use the full range of values. So there's not only 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but there are also some decimal values possible. We actually have more than 20 distinct values here. So this measure is even closer to being continuous, and this also, because it's a frequency measure, then it's less prone to the critiques that life satisfaction is. So yeah, just a quick overview of these 2 measures. So they have similar means because we normalize the happiness index. And when we look at these very raw statistics, then we can see the general patterns that are well known. Seem to be happier than the average citizens. And if we look among parents, then we see the highest subjective well-being among the parents of 2. But of course, these are just correlations, and we would like to abstract from selection into parenthood selection into the number of children and see whether there is any causal relationship here as well. So how we do that? So the framework can be summarized by this equation that you can see on the screen right now, where for the easiness of interpretation, we and because we expect that there might be nonlinear relationships, then we decided to look separately at the effect of each additional child. So the effect of the 2nd child, of the 3rd child, of the 4th child. And this is why our samples are always conditional on the number of births, right? So if, let's say, if we talk about n equal to 2, then it means that these are the families that experience at least 2 births. And our explanatory variable in that case, more than 2 kids, means that they have more than 2 children. So now you can see how the twin birth instrument might enter here. That you can still experience just 2 childbirths, and you might have 2 children after those. Or if at the 2nd childbirth the twins are born, then you have 3 children. Anyway, the parameter in which we are interested is the gamma parameter, which can be interpreted as the effect on an additional child on parental well-being. We also control for a bunch of parental characteristics. We add country fixed effects also to the specification. As I said, there most probably is a strong selection into the number of children, and this selection might be on not only because let's say happier people have children, like we see here, but also because people who expect to benefit from having a large family will have more children. So there is also a selection according to expected benefits. And in most of those, we think would lead to overestimation of the effect of the average treatment effect here. Although we could also think about the channels that might actually bias the estimate of gamma downwards. For example, if you think of parents who, let's say, of people or adults who like to enjoy life, like traveling, like going out and so on, where actually children make these activities more difficult. So they, might be the life-enjoying people, so people who report high levels of well-being, and they would plan family accordingly. So they would probably plan 0 children or few children so that they can still enjoy these activities even while having the family. So actually the bias is not so obvious. I mean, the direction of bias here is not so obvious. Anyway, we rely to break the endogeneity. We rely on the instrumental variable approach, where the occurrence of twins and on the nth birth is the instrumental variable, which if we believe that twins arrive by surprise, that twins arrive exogenously, then it should serve its purpose. Then we can compare the treated parents, that is the parents who received twins at the nth birth, to parents, the control parents, to parents who have a singleton at that birth, and see whether the parents who were blessed with twins have higher, lower, or the same levels of well-being. This instrument has some advantages. Well, it's naturally monotonic, so we don't have to discuss that much. It's highly relevant, obviously. So the birth of twins really increases the number of children people have, especially if we look at higher order births. So if you look, if this n here is 2 or larger, then we see very strong, very close to 1 coefficients in the first stages. But what is discussed a lot and what has been questioned a lot is the validity of this instrument. So its exogeneity at first place, and also whether it doesn't have any direct effects on the well-being. So the earlier critique was about fertility treatments, that there might cause higher incidence of twins. I'm pretty confident that we deal with that, because first of all, our most of the results we present are based on the second parity twins, and fertility treatments are much less frequent at second parity. Also, we do robustness checks by restricting the the instrument only to twins that are of the same gender. And you know, when twins are induced by fertility treatments, then they are not identical twins. So they could be either of the same gender or of different genders, 50-50. If twins are natural, then usually they are identical twins, which means they are of the same gender. So if we limit the twins only to the same gender twins, then we strongly reduce the share of fertility treatment induced twins in our sample. And if we do that, the results basically don't change. They become a bit less precise because we have fewer observations, but still the main results are the same. What is more problematic is that it has been shown that the birth of twins is actually not completely random, that healthier women are more likely to have twins, which might have some consequences on well-being, because also healthier people report higher levels of well-being, and also because it's easier to deal with children when you are healthier. And there are some other behavioral responses to twinning that we can think about that might be either at early years might be rather higher, like higher costs, might be rather negative. It might be difficult to deal with two babies at the same time. So basically, given that there is no alternative instrument that we think is usable here, so for example, we cannot use the gender of the first siblings in this case, because this is a very weak instrument, and especially in Europe, it is very weak when people rarely decide for having more than 2 children, and because we do not have extremely large sample, and also because when we look at the well-being, then you know, the effect of the third child, if you think about the gender of the first 2 siblings instrument, the gender of the third child might actually affect the well-being by itself, and that's why we do not really think that this instrument is as well suited. But the main argument is the strength of the instrument. So the twin birth is a very strong instrument, so we can afford it being not ideal. So first of all, we try controlling for as many parental characteristics as possible. And we also...
Barbara, you have five minutes, right?
Okay. And yeah, we also check whether these parental characteristics are anyhow affected by twinning. So here I will refer you to our paper, which is a working paper, so you can find it online, to see that actually once we control for parental characteristics, there is now direct relationship between twinning and well-being. Plus, we are able to do sensitivity analysis to see how sensitive our estimate is to small violations of exogenity, and we can afford that because the instrument is really strong. So for example, let me move to results right now. So first, you can see the results on the sample of all parents that we have. So the children are between 0 and 15. In the first column, the OLS, in the second column, the IV results. So you can see that there is a huge difference between OLS and IV estimates, where the IV estimates here points towards no relationship between the number of children, or here it's actually the effect of the third child and parental well-being. But when we zoom on different child ages, then we see a better picture. So here in the next columns, we can see different samples. So these are parents of children between 0 and 5, between 5 and 10, between 10 and 15. And if we just look on the two-stage discourse estimate, then we see that among fathers, we estimate a strong negative effect of having a third child on the subjective well-being, on life satisfaction here. But among fathers of teenage children, we actually observe a positive effect. Something similar is observed among mothers, but here the results are much less precisely estimated. So even though the coefficient here is actually larger than for men, there is much higher variation there. These are here just the sample age intervals, but we did it for every age interval, so 0 to 5 and 1 to 6, 2 to 7, and so on. So here you can see how these coefficients look like for each single age interval. So the ones that you could see in the table are this estimate, this estimate, and this estimate, right? So we saw only these three numbers in the table. Here you can see all of them. So what this graph is telling us is that for fathers, we estimate a strong negative effect of the first child once number of children is instrumented by twinning. And then for older children, we see a zero effect, and they tend to be positive for the oldest children. For happiness index, we observe something similar, but what I wanted to bring your attention to are the potential channels that might be behind this relationship. So we look not only at well-being in terms of life satisfaction or the happiness index, but we also turned to some aspects of well-being, like satisfaction with financial situation or with time allocation, with accommodation. And you can see some interesting patterns here. So a very strong negative effect here when it comes to satisfaction with time allocation. But recall that twins are used for identification. So this is actually not so surprising that a third child, which is a twin child, brings a shock here. What we should rather look at are the results for the parents of older children, where we see actually positive, either zero or a positive effect on the third child on satisfaction with time allocation. If we think about when we look on fathers, we also can see that they actually improved their satisfaction with financial situation. And if we look at different feelings, then we also see that when children are young, then the first child increases the frequency of feeling nervous. But once the children are older, then actually the third child reduces the frequency of feeling nervous, while the frequency of feeling happy seems not affected here by the third teenager. So let me stop here. So we tried looking at the relationship between the number of children and subjective well-being of their parents, and to see how this differs depending on the age of children. And what we find very interesting is that among the parents of older children, we see either zero or positive effects of having an additional child. And we tried to rule out the possibility that this finding is driven by the fact of having twins. So we have many robustness checks checking for that. We also see no direct effect of twins on subjective well-being, no direct effect at these older child ages. So we are pretty confident that actually having 3 rather than 2 children either doesn't change parental well-being or slightly increases that. And if the latter is the case, then probably higher fertility levels could be achieved if this, let's say, future benefits of children are more stressed, and if parents receive more help in the early years of children where we see the most negative effects to be concentrated.
Super, thank you. There's hope for the parents of younger children, and as a parent of teenagers, I can confirm the results through anecdotal evidence, at least. Okay, Claudius will give comments on this paper now.
Yes, thank you. I have some slides prepared, but we don't need them. So whatever is good for you, Barbara.
Well, if you can, okay, unshare, then share.
Okay. So there it is. And can you see it well?
Yes, it's in
okay.
full screen.
Format is different. Yeah. Okay. So yes, thank you for this nice talk. This was really, really insightful for me to read beforehand, and I really enjoyed this. And I think what this paper nicely shows is the relation between number of children and well-being, obviously, since this is the one you wanted to make a point about, but also that you make use of different measures of well-being. I think this is really good in how this is contributing, especially in the discussion. What I also liked about it was that you take into the age of children into account, and I think that the instrumental variable serves very well for the reason you discussed, and this is also very clear. Maybe just to abbreviate that, I get to my question and suggestions that I have, and this is that you mentioned that there is a bottleneck in the when grouping the parents according to their children's age, and I remembered that I was asking myself if you could use instead of using the age of all children only for the youngest children, maybe the age, and then you could open this bottleneck a little and include more cases into your analysis, which seems to be a problem also for your further analysis, if I understood correctly. And another question that came to my mind, since you already grouped what measures of well-being are related to these countries, and do you have already some hypothesis on these questions, and how are you going to operationalize this, and yeah, according to this, what are the regional differences that you have found so far? And also, while reading, I was since I was stuck with the data set on older people, I was wondering about the long-term effects of having more children than originally preferred. So, could you this include positive effects on well-being via social and emotional support and less loneliness? This was one thing I had in mind, and I think it's a really interesting question. So, first, and to broaden the discussion within the context of this webinar, I thought about the gender differences that you already discussed in your paper, but I think they could have a more prominent role, since you mentioned the getting back to employment effect for mothers that they of twins at second parity, that they are more likely to get back than mothers of 3 children with 3 births. So this positive relationship between employment and well-being could be discussed, as well as the increase of stress when employment and child care have to be managed. And also this could be maybe head forward to your next to your outlook that there might be gender differences in the welfare policy according to the preferred number of children.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the comments. Very helpful. We have thought about some of those, not all of them. So just quick reaction to these age groups, according to the age of the children. So what we do in the paper we present, as you said, so the age group 0 to 5 is where our parents whose all children fall in this age interval. And because our main identification is based on parents who have 2 childbirths, then we have a lot of, or the majority of parents in that group, because usually the spacing is lower than 5 years. And the reason why we wanted all children to be in that age group is that we wanted the parents with twins to be similar to parents without, so that when you have 3 kids, when you have twins, and naturally the youngest children are small, and it might be easier to deal with them when the older child is really older, it's like a teenager, than if the older child is also a young child. So to make the parents homogeneous, then we decided to put them in all this category, which and also to make it more comparable to the OLS results, right? But we also have a robustness check with having just children, just the youngest children in this limited age interval. And if I recall correctly, I think it is in the appendix. I'm not sure if actually I sent the appendix to you. Then this shock effect, the negative effect at young age is lower when we allow also for older children to be there, like so that the oldest children doesn't have to be, let's say, in the 0-5 interval. So that's it. And for the welfare and family policies, we are struggling a little bit with that because of the small data set. So it's so we cannot add look at much country-specific things, but actually we could at least add, some general measures to the regression to see whether the estimated coefficients change when we control for, let's say, parental policies. So yeah, that's definitely perspective. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for these comments and a really interesting presentation. We will be breaking up now for a brief coffee break. This is the second session. The session will be focused on inequality and deprivation. And Ingrid will talk about phases of inequality and mixed methods approach to multidimensional inequalities, while Nicolai will present a paper called Walls of Glass, Measuring Deprivation in Social Participation. And as previously, they will then discuss each other's papers. So each of you will have 30 minutes for the presentation and then a few minutes for discussion. Ingrid is first, so let's start. Welcome, and please, you can share your screen.
Yes, thank you. So the paper is called Phases of Inequality, and it's a paper where we try to present a mixed method approach to studying multidimensional inequalities. My co-author, Paul Segal, and I, who's also my husband, we both work at the Department of International Development at King's College London. And the motivation for doing this work is precisely stemming from the fact that we work in a multidisciplinary department where lots of our colleagues and students work on inequality, but it's sometimes very hard to reconcile approaches and views. So what we try to do here is to explore ways of looking at what inequality means for society. That is, we know inequality affects many aspects of our lives, but this multidimensionality leads to many disconnected approaches to studying it that sometimes gets in the way of dialogue. So we're motivated by 2 issues. inequality statistics alone give us little sense of how inequalities shapes people's lives. On the other hand, ethnographic and qualitative research rarely explores the full distribution, focusing on detail on only a subset of it. So what we try to do, what we want to do, is to study inequality, combining the representativeness of quantitative studies with the depth and the nuance of qualitative analysis of lived experience of inequality and social relations as well. So we look at economic approaches and sociological approaches of multidimensional inequality. So what we try to combine is sense capability approach, that is, we try to look at what matters in terms of the range of things that people can do and be, which are not reducible to a unitary concept. And we try to mix this with sociological approaches rooted in the work of Bourdieu and others that recognize cultural and social dimensions of inequality, and in particular, social status hierarchies, stigma, domination, or the opposite, relations where people feel recognized. We are interested in what these authors have to say on agency. Both Sen and Bourdieu explore the relationship between agency and socioeconomic structures that help us to explain inequalities, but in very different ways. As you know, Sen highlights the importance of economic entitlements, representing the economic and legal constraints on people's choices in life. Bourdieu problematizes this idea of choice, seeing agency as partly socially constructed and internalized, and acting within social structures that constrain this agency. So in the mixed approach of phases, we think we find a way that allows us to create and reproduce inequality. So when we look at multidimensional inequality, we are referring to inequality among individuals over multiple dimensions. That is, our unit of observation is the individual, and our welfare concept an array of dimensions of well-being. For example, each person, for each person, you might have their income level, the years of education, their health status, other variables, and in principle, these can be qualitative or quantitative. So we looked at other approaches to measuring multidimensional inequality, and we explore the quantitative multidimensional inequality measures that calculate a statistic of a multidimensional distribution. These studies typically present a set of socioeconomic gradients and then compute a single value for their index. That is, these approaches are restricted to quantitative dimensions, and their output is a single index number indicating the level of multidimensional inequality. In contrast, we find, for example, in the work of the multidimensional inequality framework that the NGO Oxfam uses for studying inequality in different contexts. And this type of framework presents a wide range of inequality indicators across multiple dimensions, such as income inequality, but also, for example, education inequality across categories such as gender, ethnicity, and others. Now, the MIF includes both quantitative and qualitative dimensions. It does not attempt to collapse multiple dimensions into a single indicator, but it measures inequality in multiple dimensions and not multidimensional inequality. That is, each inequality measure is independently estimated. So it does not really tell us about the interrelationship between dimensions, whether those with poor health, for example, are the same as those with low levels of education. So what we try to do is propose this mixed method approach, which focuses on inequality and also on lived experiences. Incorporating these dimensions, we try to get at a multidimensional distribution. So we look at the types and degrees of inequalities that fundamentally affect lived experiences. And in doing so, we distinguish between inequalities of lived experiences and lived experiences of inequality. In a way, our key methodological move is to collect and analyze information on qualitative lived experiences using semi-structured interviews in a sample that is stratified by income. That's the variable that we choose to stratify our data with, but in principle, you can use any other variable to stratify the samples. So what do I mean by inequality of lived experience? We also call it qualitative income gradients. Quantitative, well, I'm mixing. So these income gradients tell us that poorer people suffer more crime, are less educated, have worse health, or etc. But qualitative lived experiences also vary systematically across income. The poor have to wait longer hours to receive medical attention, or the school teachers impart lower expectations to the children. They have worse working conditions. Now, these are the issues that are studied by sociologists or anthropologists in specific populations. What we're trying to do, and we think is new, is to study these experiences systematically across the income distribution. So this is what we call lived experiences of inequality. So if we have the inequalities of lived experiences on the one hand, then what we call lived experiences of inequality is the experiences of stigma, discrimination, and domination that interact with the lived experiences of the inequalities of lived experiences. So these often arise from social class hierarchies or out of categorical inequalities such as race, gender, and sexuality. That is, people report feeling shame or being looked down on or being mistreated by others because of something that places them in a subordinate position. These unequal interpersonal relations are what sometimes is referred to as social inequality. So putting these two together, so we have the inequalities of lived experience and the lived experiences of inequality. And if we put that together, we can also investigate the inequalities in lived experiences of inequality. That is, lived experiences of inequality also vary across the income distribution. When using public health services, people in lower deciles feel disrespected by staff, while upper deciles experience sometimes horror at sharing spaces with people from lower deciles. Now, both of these are experiences of inequality. Those are experiences of social hierarchy, one from the bottom of the income distribution and the other from the top. This also highlights the link with intersectionality. And what our method does is add income level to the characteristics that intersect in salient ways. That is, women and indigenous people at the lower end of the income distribution might experience categorical discrimination in different ways from women or indigenous people at the top of the income distribution. So to sum up, we look at approaches to measuring multidimensional inequality. There are the multidimensional inequality indices that look at multidimensional inequality, but their output is unidimensional and focus on quantitative information. We have the multidimensional inequalities framework that look at inequality in multiple dimensions and have a multidimensional output, and have and they use data that is mainly quantitative but can also incorporate qualitative data. What we want to do in phases of inequality is to look at multidimensional inequality with an output that does not compress dimensions, that is, that remains multidimensional, and can combine quantitative and qualitative data. So what we did is we implemented this in Mexico City. We piloted the method a couple of years ago in the city with a set of 50 interviews. And in order to carry out these interviews, we brought together a team combining academic research with activism and journalism. Paul and I worked as the academic part of the project, and we teamed up with Oxfam Mexico, the magazine Chilango, and the journalism school Periodismo CIDE. Interviews, photos, and videos were taken by Chilango journalists for a special issue and then gathered in a microsite, and the same material was used for a report by Oxfam Mexico. So it was a really fascinating experience working with different stakeholders, and it also broadened our perspective in the sense that we wanted to get to inequality from these many angles and trying to reconcile these perspectives from different disciplines. But what we found is that Chilango at the time had an editor that was very keen on carrying out this type of work. And the goal was to shape public debate. And the magazine was very successful. It was the most sold issue of the magazine. And it created a lot of traffic and interaction in social media platforms. The report by Oxfam is about to come out. There was some delays for many reasons. And they're also using that to try to not just shape debate, but also to try to influence policy making in addressing inequality in a way that can create consensus of the need to tackle it. So what we did was we estimated an income distribution in the city using household survey Inequality and combined this data with census data to estimate the average income of each small geographical unit or a HEB. It's the minimum unit. So we interviewed 50 households, 5 per income decile, on the assumption that each household has a HEB or neighborhood average. We noted when reported households income was significantly outside the predicted decile, but we found that we were quite accurate in our estimate. We then used semi-structured interviews, asking a set of quantitative and qualitative questions, and including specific experiences and short life stories. The audiovisual material that the journalists gathered followed the same approach to try to systematically compare elements across income levels. So this is the map of Mexico City. So in the center, you can't see, but you have the old municipality of Mexico and the other adjoining municipalities that constitute the unit that is Mexico City. Now, we got the data from Inequality to look at income deciles, and we took interviews in different parts of the city. Now, I'm not going to talk about this today, but spatial inequality is key for understanding a lot of what's going on in these experiences of inequalities in the city. Municipality in central AHEBs, but also in AHEBs that are more rural or in the periphery of what we perceive as Mexico City. So these are some pictures of the type that the journalists took, and these are from the Oxfam report. So we look at, for example, the kitchens and the refrigerators across the income distribution. The same was done for how the houses look or the areas in which these households lived. So we were very interested in looking at, as I said, spatial inequalities, public services, and other dimensions of well-being. So how am I doing for time? I lost track.
You still have about 12, 13 minutes.
Excellent. So let me try to go through our main findings in 3 categories. One is the quantitative inequalities that we can observe based on pre-existing survey data. The second one is the inequalities of lived experience. In particular, I'm going to go through some of the results on health, education, and work. And the more complicated, in a way, is the lived experiences of inequality, where we try to get at hierarchies of class or gender or race. And these second and third elements are based on the semi-structured interviews we took in the city. So from existing survey, you can see what the shape of the income distribution is. That is the line in red. And we see how there's a lot of inequality in the top deciles. And for that reason, we took some extra interviews in decile 10 to be able to address that. Now, the other variables, so for example, mean years of education move nicely with income as expected, but things as people who report themselves as indigenous vary across distribution. And personally, I'm quite interested in looking what's happening there in the middle. We have a lot of qualitative studies of life at the bottom of the distribution, and more we have studies on the elites and life at the top. But how people through differences in the middle, where income is not that greatly different, is something that I would like to explore. So we could look at also from Coneval and Nick, we could look at other quantitative dimensions, for example, access to healthcare or proper housing or social security or food security or insecurity. What's interesting also, and that matches the qualitative findings, is that sometimes, for example, in access to healthcare, is not that straightforward with income, because sometimes at some point in the distribution, people lose access to some government programs, and that makes the qualitative information interesting to analyze. So in terms of inequalities in lived experience or these qualitative income gradients, if we look at health, for example, and we look at the lower deciles, we see that in our interviews, people in deciles 1 to 7 relied primarily on public health, and systematically they report long waiting times, including having to arrive at the hospital or health center super early at 4 or 5 in the morning, or having to spend the night in a queue to obtain a ticket to see a specialist later in the day. And also they perceive experiences of medical personnel negligence, including inability to see a specialist for days, even during an emergency, sometimes with tragic outcomes. They also report consistently treatment by public sector staff. That is, so what was interesting to find in the qualitative interview is that people are talking about their health care provision, and they talk about the public sector, and they talk about how they access it. But they also report using private providers, both to fill gaps or delays in public provision. That is, if they need a test, they go private, they borrow money to do so, to speed up their care, but also they do so because they feel heard and respected in private settings in a way that they don't feel in the public sector. The upper deciles, on the other hand, deciles 8 to 10, primarily use private insurance and private services. They still complain about lack of access to certain specialists. And what's interesting is when they inhabit spaces that they don't usually inhabit, that is, when they go to public services. For example, if they need a medical certificate for sick leave or checkups for maternity leave, they have to go to public services. And here it's interesting that they don't like it. When they share these spaces with lower income groups, this causes discomfort, and they report things that they conceive as inappropriate behavior of other patients. They don't tend to complain about the conditions of the public services or the provision for the public service users, but mostly they complain about what they see as inappropriate behavior in other patients. In terms of education, we see that deciles 1 to 7 have households that attend or have attended state schools, with only one exception in decile 7. But again, here is where things start interacting. In the lowest deciles, if parents want to seek better school or what they perceive as better school for the children, they tend to have very long commutes. So one child in Milpa Alta, one of these more rural municipalities that are still part of Mexico City, he has to leave his house at 5:40 in the morning to start school in another part of the southern part of the city, in Xochimilco, at 7 a.m. Some in the second and third deciles, they are reporting damaged school infrastructure because of earthquakes, but also absent teachers, large class sizes, including class sizes of up to 55 pupils. Now, in the center of the city, for example, in a low-income neighborhood, Tepito, a rough commercial neighborhood in the center of the city, a grandmother will tell us jokingly that her grandson's classmates don't place any value on education because their only career options are peddling alcohol or drugs or picking pockets. Now, what we see is that when we get to decile 6 and 7, people start reporting higher satisfaction with schools, noting things like psychological support or sport facilities, but they complain that the state schools are asking for financial contributions. One thing that is interesting is that all schools ask for these contributions. the people in the lowest decile, that is those less able to afford them, are not complaining. But when you get to decile 6 and 7, people more and more start complaining of such contributions. Deciles 8 to 10 choose private schooling for their children, and what parents are reporting is that they're proud of the school. What's interesting here too is how they describe their choices. They try to distinguish between what they see as traditional or standard Mexican schools, which they don't like, and they like the schools that their children attend because they have these foreign elements, like an American system, English lessons, Chinese or Indian teachers. Now, they all think that there's something meritocratic in terms of the schools being academically demanding, but at least one mother admitted that the selection was based on income, that is, on affordability of the high school fees rather than merit. Now, with regards to work, we found some interesting answers in the attitudes to informal and formal work in the lower decile. That is, we think of formal work as bringing with it access to public services, to government protections, even to credit for buying housing. But a lot of the people we interviewed say that they not only enjoy the flexibility and independence of informal work, but that they choose it because they feel mistreated in formal work, or they complain about the poor conditions and also poor pay in formal work. So, for example, a woman in decile 1 worked in restaurants and reported that the bosses were very rude. She had to leave because she couldn't take it. Or a man working in a factory in decile 2, he gives us a long account of how workers are treated badly, and they receive fines for not arriving on time. Again, completely disregarding the spatial inequalities in the city and the crazy long commutes that most people have on their daily lives. He also, this is a long story where he had an accident at work and he did not receive employed. And that's part of the benefit of being in formal work, but his hours have been seriously reduced and he complains that he cannot make a living. Now, such complaints about the conditions of work tend to go down in the upper middle deciles, but they still appear, including teachers who are saying that their bosses think they have slaves instead of workers. And that happens all the way up to decile 7.
Ingrid, you've got about 4 minutes to
Wonderful. So most interviewees in the top end of the distribution are happy with many aspects of their work, whether they're employees or business owners. We see a lot of interaction here with gender, for example. Lots of women are choosing to have their own businesses to be able to raise the children and while continuing to make a living. Now, what's also interesting is that here people also don't take rights as rights. One interviewee was very surprised that when she was pregnant, she was allowed to go to doctor's appointments, and this is in decile 9. So that's in terms of inequalities of lived experiences, but we also find a lot of information on these lived experiences of inequality. In particular, we see that among lower deciles, female domestic workers are reporting the most explicit mistreatment by others, especially when working in the most affluent parts of the city. Now, this doesn't happen just to women, and men too feel looked down on at work because of the type of work they do or how they look. Now, what's interesting is the feeling of distance, alienation, and sometimes inferiority that people experience where they travel for work or for other reasons to more affluent parts of the city, in particular for work. And we see this being reported in decile 3, 7, 6, and also obviously decile 2. People thinking of the people in the more affluent residents as being in another world or in another planet or in a cloud or go through life like flying. So what's also interesting to note is that the feelings of discrimination are not limited to the bottom of the distribution, and people at the top also feel they don't belong in clubs, in restaurants, or in the areas where they live. Let me skip so we can make the time. So in summary, so we find that lived experiences across the income distribution vary. And as I said, we have really interesting data on the experiences of health services as a locus of hierarchical social interactions. And also that happens with schools. People feel very strongly about how they're treated at work. And interviewees report very strong social hierarchies due to experiences of class and education. And many people are reporting feeling looked down upon. And as I said, this extends far up in the income distribution. Women across the distribution experience discrimination and mistreatment. What's interesting is that they don't report gender patterns in the household, but they do show with what they tell us about their life stories that gender roles are reinforced by the allocation of domestic responsibilities. All throughout the distribution, women are doing most of the care work and taking care of domestic issues. So we find experience of race discrimination against indigenous people at the bottom of the distribution, and in the top, we find acknowledgement of the benefits of whiteness and also negative stereotypes against those who look indigenous or have dark skin. So in conclusion, what we try to do here is to develop a new method for studying qualitative inequalities by analyzing how lived experiences vary across the entire income distribution. And we try to distinguish this idea of inequalities in lived experience from the lived experiences of inequality. By combining these two elements with quantitative socioeconomic gradients or income gradients, we provide a multidimensional analysis of inequality that tries to bridge economic and sociological concerns. In Mexico City, we find a society that is both very high in terms of economic inequality, but also very high in social inequality, stratified through income and social hierarchies that discriminates by gender, by race, and by class. Looking ahead, what we want to do is this qualitative economic income gradients and look at them, how they can provide structured methods to interrogate inequalities in specific qualitative dimensions in more detail. In particular, we want to do a new survey based particularly on care work, on how it's affected by inequalities across the distribution and how the experiences in one part of the distribution affect what people live in others. So thank you, I will stop there.
Thanks a lot, Ingrid. Thank you, this was really fascinating. Okay, now Nicolai will discuss this paper. I don't know if you want to share your screen on.
Yeah, 1 sec. The sound is okay?
Sounded good, yes.
So presentation. Can you see the slides?
We can see it, yes. Go ahead.
Perfect. So first of all, thank you for the nice presentation and the paper. I really enjoyed reading the paper. And let me also say that I think it's definitely an important and worthwhile exercise to explore this mixed methods approach, because I really believe that whether it's measures of poverty or inequality, I definitely agree with the fact that we need a deeper understanding what that actually means. And also what I liked is this is not only addressed to the academics or the technical people who develop these measures, but also because we usually talk about normative elements, this matters for the public debate too. So there must be an understanding in the public discourse, or the public discourse can help to clarify some of the decisions that have to be taken in the measurement process. So that's something I definitely like a lot. I think the presentation was quite clear, so I don't think I have to summarize this in detail. I mean, you want to provide a more detailed picture, and that in a mixed method setting, you seek to document two phenomena in a qualitative way along the income distribution, the phenomena inequality of lived experience. So for example, in the health dimension, but also the lived experience of inequality like discrimination and others. Theoretically, the approach is embedded in or relates to the capability approach by Amartya Sen, but also to work of Bourdieu. I won't make an attempt to summarize the results. Rather, I would like to I have essentially 2 lines of comments and questions if you want. So I said already, I agree, definitely it's an important exercise, but I was wondering whether there are ways to kind of tweak the argumentation why people should care about your results, or what do we learn? So to relate it to other debates or questions maybe. So one thing is you document heterogeneity across the distribution, across the income distributions in the different dimensions. But and you compare, you explain how your analysis differs from multidimensional inequality and poverty analysis. But one could also wonder how that, it's slightly a quantitative biased perspective maybe that I have, but you could also ask, how does your approach differ? For example, if we had quantitative data on those dimensions and we would go for interaction terms or quantile regressions, what would be the difference? Another aspect, I will just focus on, for time reasons, on the third one here. How does your approach maybe how does your evidence help to inform measures? For example, if we think about income poverty, we might have to decide on the cutoff. So you actually provide details about how life looks at the different deciles. So that could be one way to relate your work to other debates. In terms of analysis, one could wonder whether you have actually evidence relating or supporting or compromising the reliability of some of the respondents' behavior. So in the capability literature, for example, there is a great concern about adaptive preferences, so that respondents find pleasure in small mercies and things along this line. So self-assessed health status can be biased among those who are particularly deprived in health. So is there evidence in support or against that? So I'm not saying there's a general conclusion, but it could be interesting to relate to these kinds of debates. And then I would like to emphasize on the capability approach. You mentioned that it offers a multidimensional notion of well-being, which is definitely the case, but I think it offers more. This is not to mean that you should include all these aspects, but maybe there are useful themes which among these which help to organize your results or to streamline the narrative. One is being, of course, like it's not only multidimensional, but it also beings and doings matter, so the functioning space. And they have been used actually in, I think, ethnographic research, they have been used as narratives. In form of thick descriptions, which is not like the measurement perspective. So that could be useful. One thing that should probably be included is the discussion of conversion factors, which is a prominent feature of the capability approach. Essentially, it states people convert resources to a different degree in well-being, and you are studying something along this line. So I wonder how that would affect your interpretation. I also think you had a kind of dichotomy, like trying to argue that Zen is focusing on the material constraints and Bourdieu on the non-material ones. It's true that Zen has this focus in his work on famines, but actually the capability approach covers also social and legal norms which may affect the conversion into well-being. And as a last note on the capability approach, agency is actually also a key concept in the capability approach, which I would suggest to explore further. It's not that there is a unique approach, a unique concept, but in general, it refers to the ability to set goals according to one's own values and act upon your own values or strive for your self-set goals in the end. Agency is considered to be part of well-being, but it goes actually also beyond. The question is, maybe habitus could even be understood as a form of a failure of agency achievement. So I think my 5 minutes are over.
Thanks, Nicolai. Ingrid, feel free to briefly respond if you want, but we can also continue with a few questions. And remember that there is going to be more time for discussion in the afternoon.
As you prefer. I can save it for later. Maybe we can have a conversation at the end when. Thank you so much for that. That's lots to think about.
Yeah, so that's good that we have time later on and over lunch to go over these comments and the comments from yesterday as well. My quick question, I think it will be easier to address. One kind of serious issue in large cities like Mexico City is crime, and I was kind of wondering why you left out, or maybe you didn't. At least from the presentation, you left out crime and a kind of feeling of safety from your discussion. Maybe there's a reason for that.
So we didn't put an emphasis on crime in the interviews, but people do report feelings of insecurity. And that, I want to go back to some of the other comments. And in particular, but how when we look by income decile, social networks and so the perception of crime varies depending on how close you feel to your neighbors and your family that live in this local area. But you're right, there's a lot of perception of insecurity. It's very gendered. Women across the whole distribution feel threatened in public spaces, for example. But when we look at lower deciles, it will vary depending on the type of community built around the local space. But there's more to say about that and why care and the type of intervention that can stem from this type of analysis.
Okay, let's leave it for later then and move on to Nicolai's presentation. You should be able to share your screen and kick off. Yes, we can see it well, and I'm sure we can hear you too.
So sound is okay again, huh?
Sound is good, yes.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present this work here in this context. So this is a paper on the measurement. So it has a measurement focus, and I'm proposing in this paper a measure of deprivation in social participation. So it covers different elements. I will have a little bit of conceptual integration after the introduction. I will explain details about how to operationalize the measure, but it also has an empirical part where I'm studying the performance, but this also relates back to assess actually how the measure is doing. So whether it's like a convincing measure or not. And finally, I will pick some, not exactly random aspects, but some selected aspects for the discussion. So background quickly, it's pretty much undisputed that social connections in one way or another are a key dimension of human well-being. Prominent sources for this is, among others, the Stiglitz report, but also in the work of the OECD, it figures prominently. By now, it's pretty much standard in the consensus. In line with that, there is also lots of research related to that in one way or another, including the literature on social exclusion, for example, the social capital literature, but also the poverty literature, whether it's multidimensional or monetary. There are different connections to that. However, in many of these literatures, it turns out that there are conceptual difficulties, often with similar related concepts. And that this has been a theme in the social exclusion literature, also in the social capital literature. And then when it comes, actually, I think the Stiglitz report is a nice good example for this. In the section, they refer to social connection as an umbrella term. And essentially, they summarize all kinds of things under that term, which are conceptually quite different, I would argue, including social activities like meeting friends, but also trust and reciprocity, which are the typical social capital indicators, but also social support bands, the social networks, the number of close friends, workplace engagements, and all that. So on the conceptual side, it doesn't seem to be very clear what we are aiming to measure. On the other hand, even if we focus, or going one step further, even if we focus on the social activity aspect, which is a rather narrow one, it's not entirely clear how we actually, there are several challenges on the empirical side as well. First, social participation can be understood as an abstract activity, and the specific activities vary across countries and across places. So that's an empirical challenge that has to be accommodated by the measurement. Second, the previous research already pointed out that social participation is actually a relational activity. So it refers to the specific society in question, which has been made by Amartya Sen in 1983 in the Poor Relatively Speaking paper. And actually, not only that, even the amount of resources that is needed to participate in social life may vary with countries and organization of the society. And also, a final empirical question is, well, actually, it's more technical. How do we actually aggregate the different activities to arrive at an overall measure for social participation? That has been flagged also in the Stiglitz report, among other things. So interesting, despite the large consensus on that we should account for that social participation is an important dimension of human well-being. There are many conceptual issues, empirical difficulties, and methodological difficulties. So what is this paper doing in this context? So I'm proposing first a conceptualization and operationalization of deprivation and social participation, along with an empirical illustration. All that I will adopt the capability approach perspective, and I will argue that that sharpens the contrast with related concepts on the one hand, and moreover also guides the actual implementation, so operationalization and measurement exercise. The key idea is essentially very simple, so I will repeat it in different forms. One way, a very simple formulation is essentially I'm suggesting to use information on how often common social activities are performed in the first place. And so these are often reported with ordinal or case-account responses. And then I'm arguing that we can assign a deprivation status to an individual. For example, if this individual does not at all practice first, second, in any of these activities. So none of the activities is exercised. This can be understood as an intersection approach, which is a special case of the Alkaya-Foster framework to measure multidimensional poverty. In terms of the results in the empirical exercise, a small preview. On the one hand, my measure on deprivation of social participation, it identifies different people than similar measures or related measures, which are a material deprivation index and which is an income poverty measure. So it identifies different people, suggesting we measure something different. It also correlates as expected with what you could call determinants. So this is a simple regression analysis, but they come without any causal claim, which is also supporting that we measure something reasonable, something valid. And finally, I am also exploring the relation with life satisfaction. And it turns out that deprivation in social participation is associated with a significant loss in life satisfaction, which matters for several reasons. But I will come back to that in a bit. The paper then concludes with that a valid measure is feasible. And this may also serve as a social indicator. I'm discussing some of the aspects that are needed for being a good social indicator later on, if there is time. And essentially such a measure is the key input for documenting in the first step, so documenting deprivation in social participation, so that there are barriers that prevent people from participating in social life first, and second also that it allows deeper analysis of what are the factors behind that. This paper relates in different ways to previous research. I will just pick some of them for reasons of time. So one obvious candidate is that you can see this indicator that indicator approach to construct indicators that I'm proposing as a dimension or indicator for multidimensional poverty measures. That's one way to relate to that literature. There is also some previous research going on factors behind social participation, but that literature is more concerned with average social participation. So it's like more over the entire domain of social participation, if you want. And what I'm proposing here is a kind of different outcome variable, which is complementing the analysis, namely deprivation. So particular low and critically low achievements. And also with the literature on life satisfaction, this is interesting because there was previous research going on how single social activities affect life satisfaction. The results were somewhat mixed and not so clear-cut. But the interesting aspect is here that I'm proposing here a more cogent deprivation measure, which could complement the analysis. One contribution. Second is it turns out that social participation, deprivation social participation is a major driver of life satisfaction or dissatisfaction, similar to, for example, unemployment. One could also explain how the work relates to axiomatic research on multidimensional poverty, but I will skip that. So the conceptual integration is using the capability approach. The idea is here, as we just heard in the previous presentation, also one aspect that capability approach emphasizes is that human well-being is constitutively understood as multidimensional. That's one aspect. And the second is also that resources are converted into functionings. The freedom aspect is of course also important, but I won't emphasize this at this stage. So a frequent formulation is we have a vector of functioning achievements, which is BI. We have some resources, which is X. The individual has a resource vector, which provides characteristics, C. And all that is then converted using this F function, the conversion function, into functioning achievements. However, this conversion varies with individual-specific social and environmental factors. That's a common formulation of the capability approach. What I'm saying here is, well, one part of that. What I'm saying here is like I'm focusing on one particular element of that vector, which is often enumerated, namely social participation, which is here. I'm also dropping the characteristics functions for convenience, and I'm introducing separately a vector of activities. Could be also like simply in the same resource vector, but it doesn't matter at this stage. So this is a vector of activities that are performed. And the idea is to model activities in such a way So we have each individual can choose different activities. They are of course time consuming, so there is a constraint on what we can do with our time. And we can understand A and X both as choice variables. And the idea is that social participation is non-decreasing in both of these choice variables. Now, an important aspect is that each of the different activities here inside that A, that each individual can choose, they can be understood more or less, no, not more or less, as substitutes, but to a different degree as substitutes for achieving social participation. So in the end, the statement is, it doesn't matter whether I go to the theater or to the stadium, it's a form of social participation that I can achieve with either this or that activity. On a conceptual level, how do we assign deprivation in social participation? Well, we can do that in the usual way. So if I's achievements fall short of some critical threshold, we assign the deprivation status. And this critical threshold is for now denoted as underlined as P. I will detail this in a bit more. Deprivation in this sense is less ambitious because we actually only care than measuring the entire functioning, because we focus only on the lower tail of the distribution, if you want. So we don't really care whether people increase from the average a bit or reduce from the average social participation. We only care whether if they are below that threshold. And that already helps us quite a bit, I would argue, from the capability perspective, because several features are stressed. First, we have on the one hand, we have this kind of duality between the concrete specific social activities on the one hand and the general functioning social participation on the other. This is pretty much in line with what the capability approach proclaims. Namely, we have diversity in means, the specific activities, to an identical end. And we should be concerned with in measurement analysis with the ends. And that already helps to sort some of the things. Additionally, it also exposes the relational nature of social participation because it always refers to the common activities in that particular society. And it also actually can help to understand the varying role of income in the different societies. If I, for example, well, I come back to that later if I have time. Another aspect is that intrinsic relevance is emphasized from the outset because functionings are value objects and these are the actual objects of valuation, so they're intrinsically important, which does not, of course, rule out instrumental relevance. If we have good social networks, we may still find easier jobs and so on. And importantly, this is also, if we have intrinsic relevance, there is no need for further justification in caring about individuals achieving low levels of social participation. The literature has tried to do something or it has been done previously to rely, in addition to low social participation, on low income or low life satisfaction, which is interesting, relevant, but strictly speaking, not needed from a pure measurement point of view. And also the aspect that functionings are actually outcome variables, meaning realized achievements, helps also quite a bit for the analysis because it allows to study different mechanisms, which could be, for example, a low income, but could also be like conversion factors, like a non-accessible buildings, public buildings, for example, or more subtle mechanisms like shying away from social participation due to stigmatization because of unemployment, for example. So how do I proceed with the measurement? Well, first, the key question is like, when we aggregate across the activities, how do we do that? First question here is like, how many deprivation indicators do we want to go for? Unfortunately, well, for better or worse, there is no categorical answer to that. Well, it depends on the research question, whether you want to have a social indicator in a dashboard of a governmental report on poverty and wealth, or whether you want to devise a new multidimensional poverty measure, it depends. In this paper, I'm illustrating a dual indicator approach. And how exactly does this aggregation look like? Well, again, the idea is because the different activities are substitutes, the specific activities, the idea is our measure should ensure that social participation is not achieved through any of the common social common activities. Now, what do we observe in the data? In the data, we observe usually social activities for each individual, so AIJ, with ordered or quasi-count responses. Now, the idea is we introduce a critical amount, A for each of the activities, A underlined. So this is essentially defining when an activity is performed and when not. This corresponds to those who are familiar with the literature of the multidimensional poverty framework. This corresponds to the deprivation thresholds there. And in the second step, this follows also the multidimensional poverty literature. We introduce an activity count, which essentially counts the activities individuals participate in, which is this equation 4. And then we assign deprivation status. This is one thing one can do as I do it. Like whenever we observe an individual with an activity count of 0, we we assign a deprivation status. This is an extreme form in the sense that it's a special case in the Elkaya-Foster framework, and many refinements are possible. That's one aspect to note. Second, it's important, I think this presentation is useful to highlight that there are normative decisions or normative judgments related to the choice of the cutoffs, which is the A underline J, but also the 0 here. So we could easily say there is a bit of social participation that we allow for and still assign deprivation status. I'm adopting here a rather conservative approach. Yeah, so I don't want to discuss this in detail. There are many related concepts to deprivation or social participation. The argument here is only, and this has to be clarified by future research, the argument here is only that these things are distinct and they're, so for example, social networks is something else, it's related, but something else. Affiliation is related, but something else, and so on. This is just so many of these things would have to be explored in future research. So how does the operationalization then actually work? I'm using data of the German socioeconomic panel. I'm using both on occasions a single cross-section and at times also an unbalanced panel for selected years. The survey items I'm drawing on are actually widely used and established. It's nothing really new, so they're kind of well understood. They're also available in Hilda Stiglitz's report and so forth. One drawback is that some of the activities are not, for some of the activities it's not entirely clear whether they're really social. It's one drawback. I will come back to that in a bit. And also it's some of the activities are not asked on a regular basis. So we have some kind of gaps, which is not for the present exercise, not a particular problem. The responses are usually recorded on a 4-point scale. So, which is in this case here, at least once a week, at least once a month, less often or never. Let me skip this. So here you see the social activities that you get a sense, and you also see the variable names that I'm introducing. So the social activities include things like going to cultural events, concerts, theaters, lectures. We also have movies, pop concerts as a separate one. Then one of the issues is doing sports yourself. It's not entirely clear whether it's social. People could go just running, but given that it's Germany, one could also assume that sport is mostly performed in clubs, but I'm not making any of these assumptions. The idea is I will construct 2 separate measures to account for that and see whether that makes a difference. And the same concern applies to artistic and musical activities, which may or may not happen in a social context. The other indicators like meeting with friends, relatives, or neighbor, or helping out your friends, relatives, and neighbor have a more directly social component or in the question embedded. The distributions of these items differ, but it doesn't really matter for the measurement exercise, so I will skip that too. So how do I construct the measure itself? So I'm going for 2 indicators, and now I have to specify a bit more what I'm trying to measure with each of the indicators vis-a-vis each other. And the first indicator, DSP1, is concerned with more intimate or private forms of social participation. So I'm thinking here about more faithful or sincere forms of social participation, rather with higher mutual expectations. And this indicator draws on socialize and helping. You would only ask for help probably for people that you know a bit better. And the idea is here, or I'm constructing the indicator such that an individual is deprived in these indicators if both activities are performed at most less often. So it's rather rare to do any of these activities. The other indicator is more aiming to measure non-participation in the wider public. So here I'm thinking about together with rather casual acquaintances, which can be customary social activities of the society. You may have some shared experience, but may remain interpersonally shallow and not binding. And this indicator here draws on all of the remaining activities except sports and arts, because there I'm not entirely sure whether they are social or not. And it assigns a deprivation status if we have if all of these activities are performed never. And then I'm constructing a variant. So this is the bis suffix of the second indicator, where I'm actually including sports and arts. And in the end, it turns out it doesn't make much of a difference. It looks very, very similar, except some mechanical responses that one would expect theoretically. The other measures I'm studying here are income, the common income poverty measure, 60% of the median income, and the material deprivation index using the Elkaya-Foster method again. here you have a sense of how the headcount ratios actually look like for the different deprivation measures. The first 3 columns indicate the deprivation social participation measures. And then we have in the middle 3 columns for the income poverty for different poverty cutoffs, just to see how they respond in terms of how they quantitatively respond to changing the cutoff. And the same is true for the material deprivation measures. So we see all them side by side here to get a sense of the magnitude of deprivation in the society. Some descriptive statistics to see how the indicators perform. Of course, we have to keep in mind it's purely descriptive here, so the usual cautionary disclaimer applies. On the one hand, we see, for example, unemployed more frequently among those who are deprived in social participation indicator number 1 than those who are not deprived. And the same actually, and in a more pronounced way, can be observed for the second deprivation indicator. So we see that the unemployed among those deprived in social participation deprivation social participation indicator 2 is around 13% compared to 5% in those who are not deprived. And this is very similar between the 2 variants. And we also see a similar pattern for income. Income is higher among those who are not deprived. An interesting question is, to which extent do they identify different people as poor and deprived? And in this analysis, it's a kind of overlap analysis, if you want. We see, for example, here that some 80% is not deprived in in none of the deprivation social participation indicators, and not in income poverty measure at 60% cutoff, while 13% are only deprived in income, and around 4% are only deprived in social participation, and only about 1% is deprived in both. So we can take also the ratio of the both deprived relative to income deprived, and we see that about 9% of those who are income deprived are also deprived in social deprivation social participation. And this share doesn't really change if we play with the cutoffs. So it's not a question of the choice of the poverty cutoff. The overlap is modest. That's the kind of conclusion that you get from this analysis. And I'm doing this for the other deprivation indicators and also for the material deprivation indicators, but essentially it's a modest overlap. And here also just briefly, the overlap between the different deprivation indicators is also rather low. It's 2% are deprived in both, compared to 3% who are only deprived in DSP1 indicator and about 6% in DSP2 only. I'm also performing some regression analysis, as I mentioned, on the one hand for each activity separately, but the more interesting bit is so this is a simple linear fixed effects framework for all of the activities. It doesn't matter if you take an ordinal version. It's just to highlight, and it's also no causal claim. We see, for example, that income reduces the probability of not being deprived. So if you have more income, you're less likely to be deprived. So it's like as expected. And here's the interesting regression on life satisfaction, which I would discuss a bit more in detail. So we see here, I'm including two of the deprivation measures, 1 and 2, and the variant B of that. And the first regression here contains no controls. In number 2, I'm including some controls on age groups, marital status, number of children, regions, years, and so on. And then in the final one has also employment and income controls. And we see first that the coefficient is pretty much the same across the different specifications. What is also interesting to note is that the DSP1 has the stronger impact, which is about 0.3 reduction of life satisfaction, and the DSP2, which is the more wider society, the measure of deprivation in wider society, which is a bit weaker. So this seems to be more important if you're deprived of your friends, meeting friends, which is kind of plausible, I would say. And it's about 70% the effect here. So 70% is the coefficient of this relative to the deprivation in intimate social relations. And what is interesting, if you take these two together, which may well happen, then it's adding up to approximately the effect of unemployment. So if we want to assess the magnitude, it seems to be relevant. So it's something that is really making your life, well, unpleasant. I just want to highlight, I won't go through all of these things. I want to highlight one particular aspect which is important for this measurement exercise here, I think. There is a notorious difficulty in the measurement of poverty and deprivation, which is it preference? or is it actual deprivation? And in deprivation means in a capability perspective that people did not actually have the choice to achieve something better because that functioning was kind of not in their capability set. So they were even not able to do better than that. So no chance. How do I address, I mean, there were many ways how literature addressed this in different ways. I mean, Myck and Lensley in the Bregline-Britton studies, they introduced the enforced lag question, for example, whether or not you have meat with meal or something was always the question, is it a preference or is it like financial reasons or why you don't report this? And what I'm doing here is different elements, I would argue, try to achieve really a deprivation interpretation. On the one hand, I'm building on a relatively wide informational basis before assigning the deprivation status. So the different social activities. So the hope is, there is also some evidence on that, that there are fewer response errors, and it allows us to have consistency checks. I think the key thing that I'm trying to make here is that to lift the identification step. So that means like identifying somebody as deprived, from the resource space, which would be like the goods or the specific activities, to the functioning space, which would be the achievement in social participation. And the idea is, in this way, one could try to avoid the issues related to preferences. So that it shouldn't matter whether people want to go to the stadium or to the theater. The idea is if they don't do anything of these, then we're talking about a deprivation. And in the same way, this matters for food as well. So in the end, it doesn't matter where you get your nutrients and calories from. It matters that you are well nourished. And actually, in empirical exercises, that works quite well. I mean, if we think in terms of mall or undernourishment, we also don't need to know counterfactual information whether people really had to have the chance to be well nourished. In many contexts, it's quite clear that this is not a preference to have a BMI of, say, below 18.5.
Nicolai, you have about 5 minutes to go.
Yep, thank you. And then another key aspect is the choice of the cutoffs to improve or ensure the cogency of the indicator. So it wouldn't be convincing to talk about, for example, that everybody has to have say something close to the mean, which at some point becomes not feasible or sensible anyway. But the idea is we're talking here about no participation at all, and no participation means like never participating in anything. If we would adopt more the credibility of the deprivation interpretation. And also a final aspect on this consideration is also, I'm not suggesting the life satisfaction regressions as a routine test or something like that, but it's important to know that on average, at least, this experience hurts, and it does so in a substantial way. And this is important to know. So this is again supporting the interpretation as a deprivation. A tricky thing is, of course, cross-country comparisons. Maybe I'm not claiming that this can be done, but there might be ways to do that. I'm also discussing some of the considerations for social indicators, which I think is important if you want to implement them in practice. And they must, one of the things is, for example, that the burden must not be too high for the respondents. So using heavy time use modules could be difficult to implement in practice on large scale. So these are some considerations that have to be taken into account to make it a reasonable social indicator. Then just let me conclude. So why should we measure deprivation of social participation? Well, I would argue that first, social participation is intrinsically and instrumentally relevant. It's an important dimension of human well-being, and its deprivation requires, therefore, a sound measurement. Second, it's also actually, I think, relatively easy to operationalize, and the presented evidence is supporting that measurement is feasible and valid. And if we put all these things together, that we have intrinsic outcomes, relevant outcomes, a normative force of the measure, then I think deprivation and social participation measures like the one I proposed may help to do three different things. One is to analyze and clarify the relation with similar concepts like material deprivation or income poverty or social networks or affiliation, social isolation. We can explore that if we have a measure for that. Second, and that's important, it helps to demonstrate that actually barriers exist which prevent people from participating in social life. So walls of glass, this is why there is the title, do exist. If there is a sound measure, we can use that. And only if there is a measure, this is getting increasing attention in the public, if there is sound evidence in support of that. And of course, the last reason is also we not only want to document that there is a problem, but we also want to show that we want to analyze and to identify actually and eventually remove those barriers that prevent people from participation in social life. So now I have like a minute left or so, but I think I'm done.
Thanks, that's great. Great paper, and what a great reminder of how badly we've been socially deprived over the last year and a half. Ingrid, if you want to take the floor and make some comments, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Let me see. So, thank you. That the paper was fascinating, and the presentation was also super clear. So let me say that I cannot comment on the technical side of it in the paper, and I think it's very clearly explained how social connections are key, but they're missing in economic studies of well-being. So what the paper tries to do, if I understood it correctly, is fill in the gap. That is, we need to measure deprivation in social participation as an important functioning in capability theory. So what the paper does is, the part that I'm most fascinated by, because it's the part I can relate to more, is this conceptual clarification. That is the clarification or in the distinctions between the different elements that can fall into these umbrella terms that circulate widely. And then operationalizes and quantifies deprivation in social participation. So empirically, you find that social participation is correlated with higher self-reported satisfaction, and that people with low incomes or unemployed or with material deprivation have lower levels of social participation. Let me see if I can move this down. No, I cannot. Well, anyhow, something's happening with my screen.
It got a bit bigger.
So let me come back. Something happened with my screen. But anyhow, the focus is on social participation and then as an end in itself. And I think that that is the powerful message of the paper. That is, this social participation is constitutive of well-being and it should be an end in itself. And as such, I really like the final comment you make about mapping the barriers to social participation. And in a way, that could also be important if we try to discuss ways of removing those barriers. In the type of surveys we did, perceptions of insecurity, prevalence of insecurity, spatial inequality that get in the way of people meeting with close friends, family, or travel poverty, time poverty, would all get in the way of having these forms of social participation that you are measuring. And I think that is absolutely fascinating and important from a social policy perspective as well. Now, my question goes more towards, okay, if I look at developing countries, social participation, as you know, might also have strong instrumental value precisely via social capital and social networks. So in the interviews we do, we see everybody relies on social networks across the income distribution for jobs, for loans. We ask questions about emergency. Now, what do you do? Do you have people to borrow money if something happens? And now in lower deciles, we always find social networks make a very important difference to how households can cope with emergencies or contingencies, but also with poor infrastructure and public services. And that goes back to some of the questions you were pointing to before, which is what we find is that even at the same level of income, communities with stronger ties, that is, communities where people feel they can meet with families that are local, with people, with friends that are close friends, and for that they need to be local, that communities with stronger type or with neighbors are able to make their own arrangements when something is not working, for fixing holes in the road, for accessing drinking water, and so many other elements that, that help solve material deprivations. So I guess what I want to ask you some more, I know you mentioned it in passing, but what kind of adjustments might we need to do for these international comparisons? Can we expect significant differences between rich or developed or non-rich or less developed countries in the extent that social participation correlates with income poverty? And or how reliant people are on those social networks that are built through these type of interactions that you're identifying to cover basic needs or access to economic opportunities. So how does it translate to developing country context, do you think? But thank you, it was a fabulous paper and I really enjoyed reading it.
Feel free to respond, Nicolai. We have a few more minutes before lunch break.
Sure, I can respond. Let's see in which detail, but we can resume at later stage or later. So one thing is, in principle, I think, so I definitely agree with that social networks are more important in many ways, potentially in developing countries. The reason is that you could argue from different perspectives, but we don't have markets, or in particular, we don't have insurance, and social network in many ways is a substitute precisely for that. If there is any kind of catastrophe happening, you need money, you ask your friends whether they can help out in one way or another. I think, so in some sense, one could argue that because of that, I would argue that the intrinsic relevance of the measure would be more or less the same, but the instrumental so the implications on the instrumental relevance, they are much, or probably more severe in developing countries, because it's not only the very deprivation of your friends that you experience in the social contact, but also you lose or lack the function as an insurance. I mean, this social capital argument is a two-way thing anyway, in addition to that. So it's not, but it's not only kind of you can rely on others, but also others will rely on you. So it might, so what I'm saying is, like, the instrumental relevance vary. I don't think it's compromising or changing a lot in the terms of the intrinsic relevance. When it comes to the income poverty argument, the very idea is that income has a different role in achieving social participation depending by the country. For example, if I was to meet my colleagues in England, we would probably go to a pub and you would even have to pay around for the entire group, because that's the common practice there. But if I meet with my colleagues here in Barcelona, we just go to a square and people come with whatever they have. So I need much less income here to participate with my friends, and may vary more systematically. I mean, this is a simple example, of course, no? But so I would expect that this is makes a difference in many ways. And in terms of for comparability with other countries, I mean, what you cannot really do is compare directly the activities they're doing, because they would kind of differ. I mean, you could say you can only compare countries which have the same social activities, but then you're ending up with 2 or 3 countries and that's it. But I think this is not maybe it's feasible, I don't know, but one could try to argue that in some sense, even if you have different activities in the different countries, if you say you agree, if there is no disagreement on the activities, you could argue that even though the activities are different, in the more important space of the functionings, people are deprived of social participation in their respective country. So in some sense, on this functioning level space, this becomes comparable, which is not comparable on the activity space, if you would argue. So in some sense, whether they are excluded from different activities or for different reasons, if the result is that they're not ending up in social participation, that's the same in some sense.
Absolutely, wonderful.
Great, thanks a lot. Is there any question from among the other presenters, or perhaps from the participants? Go ahead. If not, my question or clarification to Nicolai, you didn't show too many details in terms of the distribution of this measure across various characteristics like age or health status, and I just wonder how concentrated this deprivation is in different groups of the population.
Well, I mean, I compared them on the descriptive level, which one would have to be very cautious, of course. There is something like I didn't discuss this in detail, but there is something like a life cycle pattern that is this, so it's by tendency decreasing, but it also turns out that at least for one of the indicators, it doesn't survive the multivariate analysis. So it's likely driven by factors like potentially income or employment or family. But I didn't look closer into that one. No, well, yeah, I cannot provide specific numbers on that at this stage. But for sure, I mean, it's like the idea is, of course, that that would be worth an analysis on its own. To which extent, for example, certain health discapacities prevent people from actually achieving that particular, achieving social participation.
Sure. The constraints, you know, whether financial or non-financial, are the key here, I guess. Okay, so welcome back. We are almost at 2 o'clock, and welcome to this final session of the workshop, the final 2 presentations. The session in the afternoon is called Regions, Institutions, and Later Life Outcomes, and we'll have 2 presentations as in the previous sessions. Alina Schmitz. So first, Elizaveta Pronkina from Carlos III, who will talk about USSR education work history, fertility choices and later life outcomes. And then Alina Schmitz from TU Dortmund will discuss the paper on health limitations, regional care infrastructure, and well-being in later life. And as in the morning sessions, you will have half an hour for presentation, and then the discussion will follow with some questions. We will then have a short break and meet again for half an hour of general discussion. So Lisa, you go first. You can share your screen and start.
Oh, perfect. Thanks a lot for presentation, for introducing me. It's a real pleasure to present here, and thanks a lot for including our paper in the program. So like when I submitted this paper, I was still a PhD candidate from Carlos III. Now I'm postdoc at Dauphine. But then there was also the other change. So I submitted the paper, how it was at that moment. But now, after multiple revisions, I think the result that I'm more comfortable with will regard education and labor market. I will comment briefly what we find descriptively about later life satisfaction in this context, but as a matter like of coherence and like, you know, I would rather show you our new idea about this paper. And the new title is A Tale of Two Regimes, Schooling and Work History During Communism. And as I said, so it's a joint paper with my ex-colleague from Carlos III, Telmo Pérez Izquierdo. So let's get started. So as we know that 20th century and in particular period after the end of the Second World War brought structural changes to the history of European countries. If Western Europe had, Western Europe had capitalist institutions, communism was a leading regime in Eastern Europe. And on this slide, I just show you the propaganda about Labor Day from Eastern Germany to Russia. And you see that in all these pictures, there is similar pattern. There is an image of men and women, so well, except for Poland. And we see that the conceptual finding that there is man, there is woman, they are side by side building great future. So that's something that was very typical in communism. So, and it was also fixed in some constitutions as a concept of new Soviet man and new Soviet woman. And as proposed by governments, it should be in light that of equality of rights, but also obligations in work and social lives. So if idea of these policies was very similar across these countries, the question that I was interested and motivated by in this paper, how much the implementation varied. And to understand how implementation varied, let's just look at one outcome, cumulative years of work experience, how much a person worked by certain age during communism. And here is the result. So we see women on top, men on bottom. We compare 3 Baltic countries, that is in the black group, USSR, labeled with USSR, with Soviet bloc countries that include mainly Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, Eastern Germany, and Hungary. So, and also we compare them with Western Germany. So we do see that the profile of Soviet man was actually absolutely the same across all these regimes. But what was different, the profile of a woman. So, and in particular, I would like to stress that women with primary education show very different trends. So how to read these slides? Well, these graphs, by age 50, women on average from 3 Baltic countries worked 31 years. Whereas women on average from Soviet bloc worked 25 years. So, well, 27, let's say. And you see that there is already some variation. And that's what, of course, it's all purely descriptive because there are many underlining and country factors behind these results. But that already motivated me to say that, well, the proposed regime was similar, but something like implementation could vary across countries. And to argue and to push further this idea, essentially we tried with my co-author to find the setting that can give you as good as causal estimate. And for that, we looked at 2 regions that presumably were more similar in the pre-communist era. And then looking at the outcomes in those regions, we can try to understand what is the causal impact of living in one type of Soviet regime versus the other. So, and the main research question is, what is the difference in the impact of the Soviet regime within the Soviet sphere? So, and for causal estimate, we restrict to the selected regions in Lithuania and Poland that were part of the Russian Empire until the end of the First World War. We argue that those regions could be more similar and could help us to understand better if indeed there were some differences in the implementation of the regime. The main treatment variable is to be born and to live in Lithuania during historians. I don't need to say that, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, Lithuania, or after the end of the Second World War, had to join like the Soviet Union, was annexed by Soviet Union, and indeed it was ruled by the central government of the Soviet Union. Whereas Poland was able to preserve its independence, yet it had to join the Soviet bloc, but it still was able to preserve the national government. And what we think in our paper is that the fact that it was some sort of this filter of all the policies that were proposed or suggested by, here one should be very careful with terminology, from the Soviet Union. So in Poland, they could be implemented with certain lag. And that's why we're trying to say that in this paper that countries that were part of Soviet Union, or in particular Lithuania in this example, was experienced the strong communism, whereas Poland, as a part of Soviet bloc, experienced weak communism, like weak implementation of communism. Yet it also received the treatment. Like as I already mentioned, the main identification strategy is natural experiment, and we assume that Lithuania became part of the Soviet Union and not Soviet bloc due to exogenous factors unrelated to the outcome variables. To understand why Lithuania was had to join, or better, why Poland was able to escape being incorporated in the Soviet Union. We checked historical literature, and there is no consensus there about this fact, but there are two hypotheses, and none of them directly related to the female labor force participation in two countries. One hypothesis relates to the connection between Polish and British like generals, and the other one about the role of US government due to renegotiation at the Yalta conference. So as you can see, they are not directly related. The main challenge in this, in arguing causality is the presence of any predetermined characteristics into areas. And for that, so far, what we did, we tried to use historical statistics and try to show that the two places actually are very similar in the pre-communist era. So the preview of results are first we do see that women in Lithuania studied more, but also they worked more. And in particular, by age 50, they accumulated 2 years more of work experience comparing with Polish counterparts. And those results are during communism. So apart from that, and here what is not going to be in this presentation, we have results about fertility and marriage outcomes. But I would like also to say that originally the paper meant to show also results about later life well-being. And we do find that women in Lithuania report less life satisfaction compared with women in Poland. Those results are measured after the transition period and after the dissolution of the USSR. So that's why when we cannot say that they are directly capturing the impact of living in one type of institutions versus the other, because they also can be influenced by, they are definitely influenced by the transition period into countries. So yet it's no longer in the paper, and it's still very interesting because with this setting, you can also try to contribute to this famous puzzle in literature about transition economies, where they find later life, like how they call it, transition, like a later life well-being gap among transition economies. And indeed, we also do see the difference between USSR and Soviet bloc. But again, it's purely descriptive. So, all right. So now let me show you how we see the main contribution of this paper. Well, with this study, we contribute to the large literature about the impact of communist institutions on their residents. And the prominent paper and the leading paper here was started by Alesina and Nicolai Fuchs-Schulden in 2007, when they started to use East-West Germany separation and later reunification as a natural experiment. On this slide, I just show some articles that directly speak about gender and female participation. So, and last year, it was a new article by Baker, Mergel, and Weissman who discussed some potential identification challenges in that setting. So accordingly, with our study, we're trying to bring the new setting to this literature, but also we say that apart from having the other setting, what's interesting in our case is that control group also received treatment. So our control group is Poland. That was part of Soviet bloc. So it also received some communism idea. So that's why the coefficients that we get are not affected by how much a male breadwinner family structure discouraged women from participation. So I think that's also something new in that regard. So, and finally, we are going to, as a matter of data, we are going to focus exclusively on the results about living during communism, and we isolate transition period directly. So, for the rest, in this talk, I'm going now just show very fast, briefly, map of two countries, data, identification, results, and further analysis. So first we see that the selected regions in the study like part of Lithuania almost fully, but also part of this part of Poland that was the part of the former Russian Empire until the end of the First World War. In particular, the highlighted regions are indeed the ones that were the same country before, until the end of the First World War. And thanks to our data, we can directly understand where individuals lived when they were born, but how also they moved. So that's why we're going to select exclusively residents who were born here, but also lived during communism. Next, we need to match historical data with modern day data to understand if the selected regions were indeed similar in the pre-communist era. And we start doing it with Russian imperial census that was conducted in 1897. And we looked at the demographic and labor characteristics. And we, for example, the common question that I received regards religious composition. So, or in particular, sometimes scholars, like researchers ask me if Lithuania was indeed Catholic country. And the answer is yes, it was Catholic country. So in terms of religious, there is no, it's not that we're comparing Orthodox with Lutheran or Protestant or any, we have the same religious, we have Catholics. Roman Catholic Church is the dominant, was a dominant in both countries. But also in the paper, we try to see, we've already used the Russian imperial census that was conducted in 1905. And now we're collecting data from interval censuses in two countries, in Lithuania and Poland, to argue better that the selected regions were indeed similar in the pre-communist era. So, and few words about Soviet regime. So why we think that it was actually indeed different across Lithuania and Poland. And the reason is, well, first, as I already told you, that Lithuania was part of the Soviet Union, so that's why it was directly ruled by the central government, Poland not. So on the contrary, it had national government. And we also here just list two anecdotal evidence that can suggest that point in the same direction about difference in enforcement of policies. For example, both states were supposed to be atheist. So, but Roman Catholic Church was still present in Poland during communism, and we argue that because the Vatican Pope could come and could visit Poland during communism, whereas he could visit Lithuania only after the dissolution of the USSR. So, and the second difference, land and private ownership. So in particular, according with communist ideology, all property should be state-owned. But that wasn't the case in Poland, and 80% of land were private property during communism. And again, that's something different from the stated policies and implementation. So accordingly, we see and argue that there is some variance across those countries. So finally, let me now just give a few words about data that we are using. So we already saw this shared data. Some other presenters already commented on them. So we're using, whereas not shared data exactly, we're using shared life model. So it's retrospective data that allows us to collect information from birth of individual life events from birth until 2017. So, and in particular selected individuals who were born between 1935 and 1958, so that they lived during communism. And we restrict events that happened and the choices during communism to isolated transition period. So explanatory variables include only, apart from obviously age and apart from age, so we also include place of birth, the type where a person was born, but also if property was dispossessed. So, and the outcome variables that I'm going to comment, that I'm going to show you today are years of education before 1990, and also cumulative years of work experience before 1990. That is computed at different age cuts by age 25, 50, and like employability between 25 and 50, isolating early life trade-off between working and studying. So first, now, when I'm going to show you results, let me first to come back to the initial motivation slide that I showed you at the beginning, in which we saw already that cumulative years of work experience indeed varied across those countries. So within across regimes. Now, let me show you specifically how each country varied across so how cumulative years of work experience varied across countries that experienced communism. As you can see, so we look only at work experience of women with low education. And we see that the country where women work the most is actually Czech Republic. So that's quite an exception. But then we see the group of 3 countries that are indeed all Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, that were indeed part of the Soviet Union. So, and the previous studies, what they did, they compared Eastern Germany versus Western Germany. So that this is that light orange line compared with this blue. So that's why the coefficients that were, if we're going to use our setting, bringing it to East-West German separation, we should get something larger. So as we can already see from here, whereas what we are going to compare is this black line, that is Lithuania, versus this like blue line, dashed line, which is Poland. So, and we see that in principle among communist countries, Poland was like underscoring, I don't know, like what is the right word here. So with respect to women work participation during communism. So, all right, now let me just come back to our causal estimate. And the identification is pretty trivial. So we just look at the sample of men and women, and we see how living in USSR changed work experience or education of our individuals. So for that, we should just interact, like if we interact gender and communism, then we get differential impact of regime on women. All right, so now let me just show you results. First, in the first column, we see years of education, the outcome about years of education. We see that women in Lithuania worked half year more. So, but the most interesting results, in my view, are the ones about work experience. So we do see that by age 25, women worked relatively more in Lithuania compared to Poland by 1 year. So, but by age 50, Lithuanian women worked 2 years more compared with Polish counterparts. But then we start to control for education, and then we allow also for heterogeneous impact across educational groups and, well, across educational attainment, sorry. And we still get that this difference persists. It gets a bit smaller, but the conclusion is the same, like those, like, descriptive analysis, descriptive evidence that we saw at the beginning could be confirmed using this regression analysis. So, and then we allow for like allow our controls to vary across men and women. So that's why we look separately at 2 subsamples. And also in that case, we see that most of results that we get are indeed driven by women and not by men. So still there is also an increase in employability in Lithuania compared with Poland, but most of results come from women. But now the most interesting part, in my view, is like what happens if we now change the setting, and instead of comparing selected regions in Lithuania versus Poland, we compare with West Germany with East Germany. And sorry. So here is just it's my fault. So I'm just so let me just go like, once we compare Eastern with Western Germany, we get you see 5 years more of work experience by age 15. So essentially everything that we expected in descriptive analysis, we were able to see here. But what I would like to emphasize, that the difference between, like, across regimes is 5 years, but within regime we get half of it. So it means that it's pretty a lot. So I didn't expect it from the beginning, honestly speaking, when I started to work on that topic. And I like, the main message of this paper is not that Soviet Union is a good regime, or that communism is good for female or labor participation, but the message is that you see that there is difference across regimes, but also within regime. And probably looking at Eastern Europe as a whole, one should be cautious that they experience very different patterns. And one way to show it, we argue, could be with looking at this specific example between selected regions in Lithuania and Poland. So, and finally, what we are doing in this paper, like we did heterogeneous analysis. I just skipped it very fast because I mean, it's all intuitive that low educated women are the ones who drive our results. We see that results are mainly concentrated among those women who live the most during regime, but also we try to define differently our treatment: to be born in USSR, to live at age 18, 10, and so on and so forth. It's all the same. And we also did placebo analysis, in which we assign randomly regions across 2 countries, and the best fit happens once we assign them exactly regions correctly. The ones that's supposed to be in Lithuania, I assigned there compared to the ones in Poland. So accordingly, I think I now can wrap up because it's already time. So in this paper, we did first we answered the question, what is the impact of we tried to answer the question, what is the impact of Soviet regime on individual decisions within the Soviet sphere? We did first comparative analysis across Eastern European countries, but then for the causal analysis, we focus on selected regions in Lithuania and Poland. And we do find actually that countries varied and experience very different types of like communism, and in particular Lithuanian women started at work more before 1990. I think I'm done. I'm again sorry that at some point I mixed up the order of slides, so it's embarrassing. So, but
no problem, no embarrassment at all. Don't worry. Thank you very much for this fascinating story. Relating to Poland, to Lithuania, to the history, these kind of the paper.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you very much. I find it is a very cool and interesting topic. I prepared some slides that I would like to share with you.
Go ahead, and you should be able to share it.
I have to check if this is the right monitor that you are seeing. I
yes,
think
we see it, but it's not in full screen mode. Now it is.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you again. I had the pleasure to look at the paper in more detail before, and I think I will skip most of the summary and the research questions because of the time, and I think it's already pretty clear to every one of us. What I would like to mention, one general comment is that you explained the strands of research that your paper is related to. And I would totally agree with all of that, but maybe what could be also interesting is the sociological literature on the life course perspective, because you're focusing on the older population, and also maybe the literature on the accumulation of inequality across the life course. And if you're interested in these topics, but don't know where to start, then please contact me and I can give you some recommendation about good papers to start with. Okay, I have highlighted here some of the results that were quite interesting to me, and 2 bullet points I want to discuss in more detail. The first one is that the Soviet regime led to an increase of labor market participation, and this was especially the case in women of younger birth cohorts, as far as I remember, and also for lower educated women. And I am very curious about the possible reasons for this finding, why you see no such educational differences in men, but you do in women. So was it because labor market participation in low educated men was already high before? Or maybe another reason was that low educated women were entering sectors of the labor market that men were not attracted to. So maybe you could elaborate a bit more on this in the discussion. The second result, which I found very interesting, was that there was a drop of life satisfaction in people who lived under USSR as compared to people from the Eastern Bloc. And again, there we see a gender difference, that the drop in life satisfaction was larger in men. And also with this respect, I would be curious, what are the origins in this drop of life satisfactions, and why do we observe gender differences in this outcome? By the way, I can send you the slides. You don't have to take notes if you like to.
That would be very useful. I'm like, you know, to answer now.
Yeah, of course.
So I like short memory.
Okay. Yeah, maybe just some. Yeah, maybe I skipped the first one and comment a bit more on the study design. At first, I was wondering why you focus on Poland and Lithuania. I had the impression that it was maybe a bit data-driven because no other countries are included in SHARE, but I think there are other countries, as you showed the descriptive results for several other countries. And maybe it could be cool to include some more countries in your analysis to study even more shades of the Soviet regime, as you mentioned it in your paper. That would be pretty cool, I think. Another comment concerns the outcome that you studied. In terms of labor, you were focusing on the cumulative years of working experience. And from my point of view, it would be very important to have also information on salaries, because of course, this is a very important aspect of gender equality, not only if women were working or not, but also what they could take out of their labor market participation. These were some comments on your actual studies. Now I have some ideas for the outlook. Of course, this is all really beyond of the scope of your study, but maybe you are looking for some inspiration how to proceed further. The first comment, the first point, the comparability across context, I already mentioned it. Maybe you can include some more countries. Another idea was that it would be really interesting to study if there were something like intergenerational transitions, because in your manuscript you focus on people who were born between 1935 and 1958, and it would be, I would be curious what happened to their sons and daughters. So do we see something like gender equality translating into the next generation? Or is it maybe the opposite? Gender roles are getting more and more traditional in some Eastern European countries, as some authors have commented on. And it would be very cool to investigate how the next generation can be described in regard of their life decisions in these outcomes. One last point that would be maybe something to look into in next studies would be maybe there were also negative consequences in well-being in case of women's labor market participation. it could be considered as a triple burden: housework, childbearing, but also labor market, so paid work. And one thing that is related to this point is that you discuss education as a very important channel through which female labor market participation has increased. I would be curious about the role of childcare services, because who then are the people who provide care for younger children? Is it professional childcare, or is it other family members who step in? I think this could be, yeah, also a very interesting question. But of course, all of this is beyond the scope of your study. But if you want to, yeah, go a little further, and you're looking for a volunteer to participate in your research, please contact me. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Alina. It was very detailed suggestions. So I don't know, can I reply or?
Yeah, go ahead. We still have a few minutes, so go ahead.
Perfect. So yeah, I mean, regarding sociological literature, honestly, I don't know anything about it. So I would like to be very honest. So I have very, like, you know, preliminary knowledge, but definitely not profounded. So that's why if, I will definitely contact you later. So regarding why there is no difference for men. So, and I think like how I understand this is because they already did pretty well and the same across these countries. So that's why overall we don't see anything almost for men, because profile of men didn't change that much, and regardless of regime, their life didn't change in terms of like educational attainment or work experience. But then why Poland and Lithuania? That's very you know, deep question, because to be honest, up to what I know, they could be the most comparable in terms of predetermined history. So in the conditional on data that we have, but also conditional on experience during communism. We try to find some other countries that were as similar as they, but we didn't. So, and I think that they shared the most common history. So that's why we decided to look at those countries. If you have any other suggestion, it would be great. But I mean, here there are like several factors that we would like to have at the same time: difference communists, difference, like, you know, and I don't know, like the other possibility was to look at Estonia and Sweden. We tried at the beginning doing it, but then we realized that there were even more differences, and more with Sweden didn't have communism. So that's why it will be like control group again, the one without you know, it will be different, let's say. So comparability. So regarding salaries, I'm not sure if Share has this data. So that's why it does. So, okay. So here we have
it does, yes. I mean, it's a little problematic, of course, but the survey collected information on salaries of initial and I think starting and ending salaries of every job.
I remember, like at the beginning, I don't know, we didn't look at it because, I mean, it's always a problem looking at, like, you know, self-reported financial information. So that's often a bit worse reported. But so since you suggested, and we have now confirmation that I can get those data, so then there is no excuse not to look at it. So, and yeah, and finally, like regarding suggestions and broader suggestions, I mean, you touched two big points. So first about comparability across context, and now like that's what we're trying to do, like to try to make it, of course it will be descriptive, but still, I mean, just trying to say how across Eastern Europe those periods were different. So like for work experience. And regarding transmission and intergenerational transmission, preliminary results, what we did, we found a survey and we look at the outcomes of migrants from Lithuania and Poland in US, and we try to understand how their labor force participation varied. But of course, I mean, outcomes are in 1995, 2000, 2010. So accordingly, we have mainly the first generation, second generation. So that's why, to some extent, it talks to this intergenerational story. So we do see sample size is small, but still we see that women from Lithuania indeed work more compared with Poland. So, but again, those are very preliminary, so that's why I didn't include them in this in the presentation. So, and regarding well-being, I mean, I absolutely agree that, I mean, and why we decided for a moment to take it out, because it should be the study on its own, and in particular, given this literature that I really like about unhappiness in transition. So, and the origin of those unhappiness gap, and I think it's, yeah, that will be definitely something that I would like to come back in the future. So because.
Okay, great. Thanks for the presentation and the discussion. We still have a minute for an extra question, if there is one, from the panelists or the audience.
I'd like to have one question, if I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for extremely interesting presentation. I was wondering, there's always this question why these two countries and whether they are similar enough and so on. So I was thinking, like, maybe you could use this idea that Poland used to be more east before the Second World War than it was after. So actually, what is Lithuania right now, or what was the Lithuanian Republic during the Soviet Union? Part of it used to be Poland before the Second World War. So maybe you could use the, within Lithuania differences to show whether the people there behave similarly or differently. This would kind of help you a little bit rule out the differences between the Poles and the Lithuanians.
Barbara, thank you so much for this suggestion. Actually, like, I mean, at some point we tried looking at, so it's like the Vilnius and its regions around it, no? The one that you have in mind. So the problem is the sample size. It really, like, it gets too small. And to be honest, we just, once we saw that the number of observations, like 200, so we left that idea. But yeah, it would be really.
Yeah, because I was a little bit worried actually in the other direction that, many people moved out from Lithuania because they could claim that they are Polish, so they preferred to live outside of the Soviet Union. So in that regards, you could have a bit selected sample within the Lithuania from composed of people who were more conforming to the system. That was my slight worry, and I was already thinking how to, argue that, or check whether it is a problem or not.
Okay, we have to stop for the moment to continue with the final presentation. Once again, and thanks for joining us and staying until the end. So this is the final session of the workshop. I always find that, especially in this online format, there's always too little time for questions, discussion, and so on. So I would keep it very informal and flexible, and kind of allow people to voice their questions or comments in no particular order. So if anyone wants to make a start, go ahead, and if you can address a specific paper or a more general topic if you want, and then we will continue from there. So who would start? Tesha, go ahead. Welcome back.
Yeah, I would like to know what other countries are doing in terms of dealing with the economic impact of the transition. I know that's what Jake and my paper was about. And I know in doing our search of the literature, Australians have what they call an economic impact payment. But as I mentioned in my comments yesterday, my understanding is that in Europe, no additional special payments or programs needed to be developed because the social safety net was already set to handle situations such as the economic and social disruptions from the pandemic. And I just wondered if other countries, that I couldn't find anything in the literature, other countries actually did institute some special policies, monetary policies.
So I can only answer for Poland, and Poland had a big package of support, but very little of that was direct cash support towards households in general. There were direct cash transfers to the self-employed, and they would get a flat rate benefit. But the support in Poland, and I think generally in many countries in Europe, took the form of support towards employment and support towards companies more than direct support to households. There were some policies there are benefits related to childcare when schools were closed. So that got extended, but it was again extended. What got extended in Poland was the kind of standard support for parents when kids get ill. So rather than paying sick leave payments towards children's absence from school, these benefits were extended to parents who had to stay with them because they couldn't go to school or kindergarten. I don't know if anyone could speak about other countries. Anthony.
Maybe just I have a couple of things to add on France, Spain, and Italy. So just building on the self-employment compensation. So in France, Spain, and Italy, there were also this kind of some transfers based on the fact that you are self-employed, and it was also based on your cash flows and your profits. And so depending on the profit and the size of your company, you were receiving different lump sum of money. But like, for instance, in Italy, it was ridiculous. Like, we were giving, I think, like 600 euros per month to self-employed, irrespective of their size or something like this. So it really wasn't a lot. When it comes to Germany, we know that the person who suffered the most in terms of economic consequences of the COVID-19 are the self-employed. Really, this is where you see the massive drops in income. Because I think in Germany, and we have some German in the audience, you can confirm this, but like self-employed were not really supported by the government, from at least what I can see in the data.
Commenting on that, it was really a time lag when the monetary benefits were paid to the self-employed. So that was the main problem. What the other major contribution was the short time allowance for not for the self-employed, but for the others, that meant that it was paid by unemployment insurance and was easily accessible within a short time. So there was this huge gap between those two groups, to say so. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to get back to the comment. I think, Michal, you mentioned that additional support was provided to families when the children were homeschooled or virtually learning or whatever. So do you mean financial support? Is that what happened?
Yes,
so it was like
so in Poland, when your child, in most countries in Europe, when your child is ill, you can take some time off, paid leave essentially. So this paid leave was extended from 5 days a year to basically as long as it was needed and as long as schools and kindergartens were closed.
Okay, so there was no additional income support. It was just the leave policy was extended.
Well, yeah, but it's in a way, you could take paid leave, which was paid by the state rather than the companies.
Right, right. So that
So
was an in-kind transfer of a kind. Yeah.
It was a
Transfer.
It was a cash transfer. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
In Germany, please, Claudius, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was something like a bonus that was paid for all families, irrespective of working conditions and income. So every family got a bonus of a few €100. And I think right now they are discussing about to have a second round of this bonus, but I'm not quite sure about these developments there. Maybe Claudius can help with it.
Okay, so there was no income limit on that, unlike in the US where there was an income limit.
No, it was paid to all families of all income groups.
Okay. Was it just a one-time and
thing? Maybe there will be a second bonus, but I'm not quite sure about these developments there.
Tessia, for a more general and more, I think, detailed account of those policies, there is of course a lot of initiatives at different levels, but there is a program called Euromod, which
I know that,
which models benefits and taxes in all European countries, and the program has had a special initiative to collect information on all sorts of direct and indirect policies towards households, and I think more to have a reliable resource and a reference more than a chat with us.
That's great. I'll check with your mod. I'll check with your mod folks on that.
It should be really useful. So. And when we're discussing this, I was just wondering, because you, Tessia, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the direct questions of what people do with the money, and of course that's a little bit problematic, because you never know what people say and how they report what they did with the money. You know, if the money goes towards is supposed to go towards children, they say, we spent it on extra classes. How reliable do you think this information is in terms of, really the extra money going towards the items that people report?
Well, we've actually compared our results to some Philadelphia Fed results, that were collected for the first phase and in part of the second phase. And it was what I call the question 19, how people use the money. Do they use it, do they report using it for food or medical care or whatever? It was that long list of, and our results are very, very similar to theirs. They have a sample size that's much smaller than the Household Pulse survey, but the response rates for those categories are very, very similar. It was reassuring to us when we saw that. And then that was for the question 19, so the not mutually exclusive groups. And then when you look at the mutually exclusive response, if it's for spending primarily for debt or primarily for savings, again, we get results that are very consistent with what the survey the University of Michigan has shown for phase 1. So we feel that based on comparisons to other data that the Household Pulse survey is
okay, thanks a lot.
It's giving us this spending behavior.
Right. Okay, so let me start from a different angle. Perhaps there's someone who wants to respond to specific comments by the discussants, or raise the points from the discussion that you've heard. Everything seems to be
all right. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was very interested in the research on caregiving. And so I know I had to come in later because of the time difference. So in the caregiving works, I know some of it was more recent. So is there information also on the amount of time that is provided for caregiving to like older adults, children, etc., or is this just caregiving of older adults, like in facilities or something like that? So it's a clarification type of a question.
So I think this question is directed to me, right?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, the analysis were not about informal caregiving, but on care infrastructure as measured by long-term care beds in institutions. But a colleague of mine is working on informal caregiving, and unfortunately, we only have in this share data set information on if a person is a caregiver or not, but we don't have further information on the amount of caregiving or hours spent of caregiving, maybe other people involved in caregiving too, besides of the main caregiver. So from what I know, we have this information not included in the data set.
Well, has anybody have anybody looked at the time use data from Europe to try to assess the informal, like say in combination with the formal? Because, for example, Greece seemed to have very few beds in long-term care in the facilities. But is it because in Greece they have a culture of providing that care at home, so informally? So, you know, when you look at the differences across the countries, I'm just wondering, you know, the culture for formal versus informal caregiving.
Yeah, I think generally spoken, you can say that in Southern European countries, there is this strong tendency for informal caregiving within families. But yeah, we can also see some differences in Southern European countries. So maybe this also relates to Lisa's presentation, that you have to be kind of careful and maybe not throw all of the countries into one. You know what I mean? So you have to differentiate, because in general, so Southern European countries, they have this tendency for informal caregiving, but when comparing countries specifically, you see quite some differences.
Right, thank you.
If I may add about frequency of informal care, like in principle with, because I mean, I had a project on it, so, and it's always very difficult to look at intensity using cross-country analysis, but there is information about frequency of care that is measured as 4 categorical variable, like daily, monthly, weekly, and I don't remember, like less rare. So, and if you plot it across country groups in Europe, where you have Mediterranean world versus Central and Nordic countries, then you see a clear gradient that daily caregivers appear, and mainly concentrated in Southern Europe. So, but there is very little information about time devoted. So as far as I remember, it was in the first, like in 2006, it was there, that question about time devoted, but then it became frequency of informal care.
Yeah, certainly this problem, as I said, will be more and more clear and challenging to the public authorities, and it seems that very many countries and regions are completely unprepared to provide care, and with a lot of migration within Europe, the opportunity of the younger generations to care of their parents or grandparents, maybe even, will be becoming less and less likely. Having said that, we can allow me to jump into the other part of the age distribution to Barbara's paper. It's also related to care, but also but I had a more kind of technical question to you concerning sampling of families with regard to the number of children, because if you have these, well, if you have let's say 3 children, and some of them have already left the nest, so to speak. I just wonder how you've dealt with that. You know, you might observe a couple with 1 child who's a teenager, but that's only because their 2 or 3 older children have already gone to university or have whatever established their own households. How have you dealt with that?
Yeah, this is a very relevant question, and we devoted quite a lot of discussion to that. So this is one of the reasons why we stop at the age of 15 and do not include older children, and also that all the children in the household have to be 15 or younger. So we exclude households with older children, well, because this is a cross-sectional data set, and it's like many other, we don't know anything about the children who moved out, as you suggest. So we basically rely on the fact that usually children are relatively closely spaced, and that usually in Europe they live with their parents until, like, by the age of 20, they usually live by their parents, or at least officially, you know, they are part of the household. Even if they are studying, they live, you know, in some dormitories, but they are part of the household officially. So this is the only way we can do that, right? So just stop at some age and assume that we capture the majority of children. I would feel very insecure, like working with parents who have, let's say, 18 or years old children, because then, you know, it's really harder to rule out the possibility that I have another, like, 21-year-old who is not there anymore. When I stop at 15, you know, the probability that there is a 21-year-old child in the same family whom we don't observe is lower, but we cannot rule it out completely this possibility.
Okay, so the analysis is limited to kids age 15, but you kind of include as their brothers and sisters those who are older and still live in the household.
Yeah, so no, so I limited to the families for whom I observe children 15 or younger. I throw away all the families where I see an older sibling. Of course, I don't know if there is any older sibling that I do not observe, but hopefully there are not so many of those.
Not so many. Okay, thanks a lot.
Can I make a comment on this point?
Go ahead.
I think it's interesting, this like measurement of fertility, because you get the censuring on the other end too. Like, I think there's almost like 2 big groups of paper in this literature. The ones that are like, you know, they follow the kids until they're adults, and then you know that there's no censoring on the bottom end. So like people who go on to have more kids. And I think in Barbara's paper, that's and papers I've done in this too, that's like, it's something we accept, that when you work with young kids, there's always the chance that parents follow up and have more kids afterwards. But there's like, I think there's a huge group of papers that do this. There's this recent paper by Aronson and co-authors now, 4th co, I think maybe published in the EJ, where they look at 200 years of data on kids, and they quite explicitly say that because they want to see all these kids and they want to see fertility as like a flow, they just have to basically accept that they're going to get this quite limited picture of, you know, women giving birth in a restricted range, and the dynamics of fertility are going to be like always hard to catch, I guess, in data, especially when you're trying to use like survey data and quite broad data. But I don't know, the measurement things are like super interesting, I think, on these papers.
Yeah, completely agree.
Excellent. Any other points or questions? Well, if not, then I'll keep talking. I have a question to Yuki, actually. I was wondering if in your experiment, you know, how did you decide on the level of difficulty with which the puzzle started? We've been trying to solve the puzzle with some colleagues here yesterday, and we talked about your experiment, and we were wondering if there is if you know, someone must have thought of some clever algorithm of trying to find it out, because presumably there is. Presumably there is always the best move, right? And I just wonder if the move sometimes will be very obvious, the best move will be sometimes very obvious, but sometimes if the starting point is very complicated, it's not going to be so obvious even to an experienced player. So how did you decide on this, and how the complexity of the starting point of the game changed the behavior? Maybe that's something that could be studied as well.
Right. I practiced several puzzles, and then choose the puzzle difficulties that are adequate. So I run the experiment. I let people play the puzzle. Students play the puzzle, and then I see how they solve, how fast they solve, and then how many corrections they have. And then, so basically, I practiced on the difficulties.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then you kind of allocate. You give the same level of difficulty to each couple, or the generated by some algorithm, or how does it go?
So in the main experiment, yes, I give the same difficulty for everyone. So I predetermine the puzzle, and then everyone plays the same puzzle in each round. So yeah.
Okay. It's a very interesting. There's very many games that people play in these experiments, but this one seemed to us very interesting. And I was also wondering if you stumbled on pairs of people who keep correcting each other and thinking that their move is better.
Yeah. So about 5% of the puzzle, they keep correcting each other, and then yeah. So there are some people. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. You could go on forever.
Yeah.
With two overconfident players. Okay. Well, there is still a chance to comment on papers or ask further questions.
If I may.
Go ahead.
Anthony, I remember your study yesterday. So can I ask about yesterday?
Yeah, sure.
And, I remember that you discussed heterogeneity across gender, and I remember marital status. I don't remember across age. What do you see? Like elders, or I remember about income. So the ones who suffered the most were the rich ones, but olders were more affected, or youngers?
We found the effect to be stronger for the youngest. That's what we found in the raw data for the stringency index. But the thing is, we didn't keep it in the paper because age also correlates very much with the labor force status, and it wasn't that much a matter of age at the end of the day. When we're putting together, the interaction with age and the interaction with the labor force status, we realized that actually it was just a matter of labor force status. So there is in the raw data this age heterogeneity, but I'm not sure it's really quite a matter of age per se.
Okay, so because my question was looking at those 50 plus retirees. Do you see some difference, or
exactly? Yeah, exactly. The effect of the stringency is stronger for those who are on the labor market, those working, and also those with the weakest ties to the labor market. So it's about the unemployed, but it's also about the one who are working, but not in the essential sectors, the one that are the most likely to be exposed to disruptions.
Okay.
So for the respondents over age 55, 60, we found that the effect was lower, but it's because they are retired, because their income is not really, it doesn't change over time. Like pensions were stable more or less. So
exactly, yeah.
But by the way, I'm also happy that we have Damien with us this afternoon, because we find an effect by gender, and we used to think about different stories, and I think potentially the paper you presented yesterday, Damien, can also enter into the picture, because we have an effect of the stringency measures that is negative and stronger for women in terms of life satisfaction. So we won't be able to look at domestic violence or this kind of variables because I don't think we have them, but potentially it's something that's also contributed, unfortunately, to this gender differences in terms of happiness.
That's super useful. I'm sorry I missed so many presentations. We were in lockdown ourselves, so I had my kids here. But yeah, I'm gonna have to read up on everything I missed.
Yes, the pandemic has been affecting us on all sorts of levels. Anyway, we still have a few minutes, so that's the chance to keep talking. We will.
Well, maybe not a question on my side, but more like a comment for Yuki. Like, you made me very self-conscious about the comments I'm now giving to people during presentations. So I hope it's for the best, but now I'm really thinking 3 or 4 times before making any comments. And I swear on my side, I don't take them personally. So you can make comments to my papers and we can work together in the future. Absolutely no problem.
That's what you say.
That's what I said.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Yes, no, it's a fascinating experiment, and as we were discussing yesterday, it's strong. The results are strong and fascinating, even on this sort of plain level between players of the same status, so to speak, and it might be even stronger when criticism is supposed to be voiced towards your superiors. So that's an important point about making points and perhaps ways of making points. But I still firmly believe in critical comments as long as they are constructive. So if anyone has any more critical or positive comments, also constructive, now is the time to speak up, because we will be closing the workshop soon. Anyone from the attendees, you can unmute yourself if you have a question, and just give us a shout as well, any of the speakers. Okay, if not, then let me wrap it up. Thank you very much for joining us. I've really enjoyed the workshop, and I hope you have as well. We've had good attendance and very many interesting papers, and I hope you have benefited from the careful and detailed discussions and some questions and general discussion. We've discussed fertility, we've discussed old age care, we've gone through all sorts of levels at which the COVID pandemic has affected our lives and has affected our well-being. Thank you very much for all your contributions. We were hoping that we would be able to meet in person this year. It proved impossible with the developments we see now. There is some hope that we can meet soon, and I really hope we can do that. We can do that next year. We can meet in person, and we can continue then our discussions and exchanges. I really miss these coffee breaks and dinners. A lot of good points and observations and suggestions are made during those. We've been deprived of the benefit of such interactions. We've heard about the importance of social deprivation today, and I hope we will no longer be so much socially deprived through the lockdown and all sorts of restrictions, and we can safely go back to regular lives. They will not be the same probably as they were before the pandemic, but let's hope they can be as close to normal as possible. Thank you very, very much for being with us. Thanks to the organizers, to Dominic and Davis. Thanks to SIDA for supporting the organization of the workshop, for supporting the Froggy project and the free network. those of you who've received so many good comments, we will probably have a busy summer. To everyone else who can relax, have a restful few weeks or months, or however long break you take, enjoy it, and make most of the time when for the moment the pandemic has eased off in Europe at least. And we will be in touch. I hope we will be informing you about our initiatives. You know, we will be continuing with the Free Network and the Froggy initiatives in the future. So I really hope to, you know, that we can stay in touch and eventually meet in person and continue the fruitful and interesting discussion we've had over the last few days. So thank you very much for being with us, and stay safe, and see you in person soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.